Chapter 44 of The Lamplighter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bridget Gaige. The Lamplighter by Maria Susanna CUMMINS. Chapter 44. An opportunity I here have had, to try thee, sift thee, and confess, have found thee proof against all temptation. Milton. "Certainly," said Mr. Emery, who had waited patiently for the conclusion of Willie's story. "I can well understand that. A man of a generous spirit could hardly fail to cherish a deep and lasting gratitude for one who devoted herself so disinterestedly to a trying and toilsome attendance upon the last hours of beloved friends, to whose wants he himself was prevented from ministering. And the warmth with which you eulogize this girl does you credit, Sullivan. She must, too, be a young person of great excellence, to have fulfilled so faithfully and well a promise of such remote date that it would probably have been ignored by a less disinterested friend. But do not let any enthusiastic sense of honor induce you to sacrifice yourself on the shrine of gratitude. I shall find it hard to believe that a young man who has had the ambition to mark out, and the energy to pursue, such a course on the road to fortune as you have thus far successfully followed, can, in his sober senses, have made a serious resolve to unite himself and his prospects with an insignificant little playmate, of unacknowledged birth, without beauty or fortune, unless there is already a standing engagement, by which he is unwillingly bound, or he allows himself to be drawn on to matrimony by the belief that the highest compliment he can pay, namely, the offer of himself, will alone cancel the immense obligations under which he labors. May I ask if you are already shackled by promises?" "I am not," replied Willie. "Then listen to me a moment. My motives are friendly when I beg you not to act rashly in a matter which will affect the happiness of your whole life, and to hear, with patience too if you can, for Willie already gave symptoms of restlessness, the few words which I have to say on the subject. You are much mistaken, my young friend, if you believe that the happiness of Gertie, as you call her, a very ugly name, by the way, can be insured any more than your own by an ill-assorted union, of which you will both find occasion to repent. You have not seen her for 6 years. Think, then, of all that has happened in the meantime, and beware how you act with precipitation. You have all this time been living abroad, engaged in active life, growing in knowledge of the world, and its various phases of society. In India, to be sure, you witnessed a mode of life wholly different from that which prevails with us, or in European cities; but the independence, both of character and manner, which you there acquired, fitted you admirably for the polished sphere of Parisian life, to which you were so suddenly introduced, and in which, I may say without flattery, you met with such marked success. Notwithstanding the privilege you enjoyed of being presented in polite circles as the friend of a man so well known and so much respected as Mr. Clinton, you cannot have been insensible to the marked attentions bestowed upon you by American residents abroad, or unaware of the advantage you enjoyed, on your return home, from having been known as the object of such favor. Though not so fortunate as to meet you in Paris, I was there at the same time with yourself, and had some opportunity of being acquainted with facts which I am sure you would have too much modesty to acknowledge. That you were not wholly devoid of taste for choice society it is easy to infer, since otherwise you would never have been able to render yourself an ornament to it, or even maintain a place within its precincts. It is also equally evident that your pride must have been flattered, and your views in life somewhat biased, by the favorable reception you have met, both abroad and at home, not only from your own sex, but also from the young, fair, and beautiful women who have honored you with their smiles, and among whom she whose name the crowd already associates with your own stands preeminent. When I think of all this, and of those pecuniary hopes you may so reasonably indulge, and on which I have already dilated, then imagine you suddenly flinging all these aside, to chivalrously throw yourself at the feet of your mother's little nurse. I confess I find it impossible to keep silent, and avoid reminding you of the reaction that must come, the disappointment that must ensue, on finding yourself at once and forever shut out from participation in pleasures which have been within your reach, and voluntarily discarded. You must remember that much of the consideration which is to be paid to a young bachelor of growing prospects ceases to be awarded to him after marriage, and is never extended to his bride, unless she be chosen from the select circles to which he aspires. This unproportioned orphan, with whom you propose to share your fate, this little patient schoolmistress." "I did not tell you she had ever been a teacher," exclaimed Willie, stopping short in his walk up and down the room, which latterly he had been, in his turn, pacing impatiently, while he listened to Mr. Amory's words. "I did not tell you anything of the sort. How did you know it?" Mr. Amory, who by his negligence had thus betrayed more knowledge than he had been supposed to possess, hesitated a moment, but quickly recovering himself, answered with apparent frankness, "To tell the truth, Sullivan, I have seen the girl, in company with an old doctor." "Dr. Jeremy?" asked Willie, quickly. "The same." "When did you see her? How did it happen?" "Do not question me," said Mr. Amory, petulantly, as if the matter were of little consequence, and he did not choose to be interrogated. "I happened to see the old gentleman in the course of my travels, and this Gertrude Flint was with him. He told me a few facts concerning her. Nothing to her disadvantage, however. In warning you against a mésalliance, I speak only in general terms." Willie looked at Mr. Amory in a half scrutinizing, half wondering manner, and appeared on the point of persisting in his attempt to learn further particulars. But Mr. Amory, taking up the thread of his previous conversation, went on, without giving him a chance to speak. "This Gertie, as I was saying, Sullivan, will be a dead weight upon your hands, a constant drawback to all your efforts for the attainment of fashionable society, in which it is hardly to be expected she can be exactly fitted to shine. You yourself pronounce her to be without wealth or beauty. Of her family you know nothing, and have certainly little reason to expect that, if discovered, it would do her any credit. I believe, then, that I only speak from the dictates of common sense, when I bid you beware how you make, in the disposal of yourself, such a very unequal bargain." "I am very willing to believe, sir," said Willie, resuming his seat, and settling himself into a composed attitude, "that the arguments you have so powerfully brought to bear upon a question most important to my welfare, are grounded upon calm reasoning, and a disinterested desire to promote my prosperity. I confess you are the last man, judging from our short, but for the length of time, intimate acquaintance, from whom I should have expected such advice, for I had believed you so independent of the opinion and so indifferent to the applause of the world that they would weigh but little with you in forming estimates for the guidance of others. Still, though your suggestions have failed to influence or in the least degree change my sentiments or intentions, I fully appreciate and thank you for the sincerity and earnestness with which you have sought to mold my judgment by your own, and will reply to your arguments with such frankness as will, I think, persuade you that, so far from following the impulses of a blind enthusiasm, to plunge with haste and precipitation into a course of action hereafter to be deplored, I am actuated by feelings which reason approves, and which have already stood the test of experience. You speak truly when you impute to me a natural taste for good society, a taste which poverty, and the retirement in which my boyhood was passed, gave me little opportunity to manifest, but which had, nevertheless, no small influence in determining my aims and ambition in life. The fine houses, equipages, and clothes of the rich, had far less charm to my fancy than the high-bred ease, refinement, and elegance of manner which distinguished some few of their owners who chanced to come under my observation. And, much as I desired the attainment of wealth for the sake of its own intrinsic advantages, and the means it would afford of contributing to the comfort and happiness of others, it would have seemed to me divested of half its value should it fail to secure to its possessor a free admittance to the polite and polished circles upon which I looked with admiring eyes. I needed not, therefore, the social deprivations I experienced in India to prepare me to enter with eager zest into the excitement and pleasure of Parisian life, to which, through the kindness and partiality of Mr. Clinton, I obtained, as you are, it seems, aware, a free and immediate introduction. It is true I was summoned thither at a time when my spirits had been for months struggling with the depression occasioned by sad news from home, and had not, therefore, the least disposition to avail myself of Mr. Clinton's politeness; but the feebleness of his health, and his inability to enter largely into the gaieties of the place, compelled me continually to offer myself as an escort to his daughter, who, fond of society, and reluctant to submit to any exclusion from it, invariably accepted my services, thus drawing me into the very whirl and vortex of fashionable life, in which, I confess, I soon found much to flatter, bewilder, and intoxicate. I could not be insensible to the privileges so unexpectedly accorded to me, nor could my vanity be wholly proof against the assaults made upon it. Nor was my manliness of character alone at stake. My position in fashionable circles threw other and more serious temptations in my way. The soundness of principle and simplicity of habit, implanted in me from childhood, and hitherto preserved intact, soon found themselves at stake. I had withstood every kind of gross temptation, but my new and refined associates now presented it to me in that more subtle form which often proves a snare to those over whom, had it come without disguise, it would have no power. The wine cup could never have enticed me to the coarse and disgusting scenes of drunken revelry, but held in the hands of the polished gentlemen, who had but a moment before been the recipients of popular favor and women's smiles, it sparkled with a richer lustre, and its bitter dregs were forgotten. The professed gamester, the well-known rogue, would in vain have sought me for an accomplice, but I was not equally on my guard against the danger which awaited me from other and unexpected quarters. For how could I believe that my friends, Mr. Clinton's friends, the ornaments of the sphere in which they moved, would unfairly win my money, involve me in entanglements, and lead me on to ruin? I almost wonder, as I look back upon the few first weeks of my residence in Paris, that I did not finally fall a victim to some one of the numerous snares that were, on every side, spread for my destruction, and into which my social disposition, my fearless, and, at the same time, unsophisticated nature rendered me especially prone to fall. Nothing, I am persuaded, but the recollection of my pure-minded and watchful mother, whose recent death had given new freshness and life to the memory of her many warning counsels. At the time they were bestowed, deemed by me unnecessary, but now, in the moment of danger, springing up and arming themselves with a solemn meaning. Nothing but the consciousness of her gentle spirit ever hovering around my path, saddened by my conflicts, rejoicing in my triumphs, could ever have given me courage and perseverance to resist, shun, and finally escape altogether, the pitfalls into which my unwary steps would have plunged me. These darker evils, however, successfully combated and subdued, there were others of scarcely less magnitude awaiting me, and in which much of my future well-being and usefulness were involved. In the unvaried round of pleasure in which my days, and nights even, were frequently passed, there was much to gratify my self-love, foster my ambition, and annihilate every worthier emotion. And here, believe me, my safety lay in my success. Had I approached the outskirts of fashionable life, and been compelled to linger, with longing eyes, at the threshold, I might, even now, be loitering there, a deceived spectator of joys which it was not permitted to me to enter and share; or having gained a partial entrance, be eagerly employed in pushing my way onward. Admitted, however, at once into the very arcana of a sphere I was eager to penetrate, my eyes were soon opened to the vain, hollow, and worthless nature of the bauble fashion. Not that I did not meet within its courts the grace, wit, talent, and refinement which I had hoped to find there, or that these were invariably accompanied by other and less attractive qualities. No, I truly believe there is no class which cannot boast of its heroes and heroines; that there are within the walls of fashionable life men and women who would grace a wilderness. Nor do I despise forms and ceremonies which are becoming in themselves, and conducive to elegance and good breeding. As long as one class is distinguished by education and refined manners, and another is marked by ignorance and vulgarity, there should be, and there must, in the nature of things, be a dividing line between the two, which neither, perhaps, would desire to overstep. But this barrier is not fashion, which, both abroad and at home, oftentimes excludes the former, and gives free admittance to the latter; and if I presume to adopt a higher standard, it is because I have had so close an acquaintance with that already set up, that I can judge how little it is to be trusted. "You are young," said Mr. Emory, "to be such a philosopher. Many a man has turned away with disgust from an aristocracy into which he could himself gain no admittance, but few renounce it voluntarily." "Few, perhaps," replied Willie. "Few young men, at least, have such opportunities as I have had to penetrate its secrets. I trust I may say without treachery, since I speak in general terms only, that I have seen more ignorance, more ill breeding, more meanness, and more immorality in the so called aristocracy of our country than I should have believed it possible would be tolerated there. I have frequently known instances in which the most accomplished gentleman, or the most beautiful lady, of a gay circle, has given evidence of unpardonable want of information on the most common topics. I have seen elegant evening assemblies disgraced by a degree of rudeness and incivility which reflected as little credit on the taste as on the feelings. I have seen the profuse and lavish expenditure of to-day atoned for by a selfish and despicable parsimony on the morrow. And I have seen a want of principle exhibited by persons of both sex, which proves that a high position on earth is no security against such contamination of the soul as must wholly unfit it for an exalted place hereafter. I have witnessed no less myself, said Mr. Emery, but my experiences have not been like those of other men, and my sight has been sharpened by circumstances. I am still astonished that you should have been awake to these facts. I was not at first, answered Willie. It was only gradually that I recovered from the dazzling, blinding effect which the glitter and show of fashion imposed upon the clearness of my perceptions. My suspicions of its falsehood and vanity were based upon instances of selfishness, folly, and cold-heartedness, which, one after another, came to my knowledge. I could relate to you the thousand mean deceits, the contemptible rivalries, the gross neglect of sacred duties, which came under my immediate observation. But I will not betray the secrets of individuals, or weary you with their recital. Especially was I astonished at the effect of an uninterrupted pursuit of pleasure upon the sensibilities, the tempers, and the domestic affections of women. Though bearing within my heart an image of female goodness and purity, this sweet remembrance, this living ideal, might possibly have been driven from its throne, and supplanted by some one of the lovely faces which at first bewildered me by their beauty, had these last been the index to souls of equal perfection. There may be, I have no doubt there are, noble and excellent women, moving in the highest walks of life, whose beauty, grace, and other outward adornments are less admirable than their own high natures. But among those with whom I became familiarly acquainted, there was not one who could in the least compare with her who was continually present in my memory, who is still, and ever must be, a model to her sex. It is no wonder that others failed to come up to my conception of all that is lovely in woman, since the character of Gertrude Flint was the standard by which each in my mind was measured. How could I help contrasting the folly, the worldliness, and the cold-heartedness around me, with the cultivated mind, the self-sacrificing, and affectionate disposition of one who possesses every quality that can adorn life, whether at home or abroad? You have indeed failed to convince me that Gertrude can in any way be a drawback or disadvantage to the man who shall be so fortunate as to call her his. For my own part, I desire no better, no more truly aristocratic position in life, than that to which she is so well entitled, and to which she would be one of the brightest ornaments, the aristocracy of true refinement, knowledge, grace, and beauty. You talk to me of wealth. Gertrude has no money in her purse, but her soul is the pure gold, tried in the furnace of sorrow and affliction, and thence come forth bright and unalloyed. You speak of family and an honorable birth. She has no family, and her birth is shrouded in mystery, but the blood that courses in her veins would never disgrace the race from which she sprung, and every throb of her unselfish heart allies her to all that is noble. You are eloquent on the subject of beauty. When I parted from Gertrude she was, in all but character, a mere child, being only 12 or 13 years of age. Though much altered and improved since the time when she first came among us, I scarcely think she could have been said to possess much of what the world calls beauty. For myself, it was a matter of which I seldom thought or cared, and, had I been less indifferent on the subject, she was so dear to me that I should have been utterly unable to form an impartial judgment of her claims in this respect. I well remember, however, the indignation I once felt at hearing a fellow clerk, who had accidentally met her in one of our walks, sneeringly contrast her personal appearance with that of her mutual employer's handsome daughter, the same Miss Clinton of whom we have been speaking, and the proportionate rapture with which I listened to the excellent teacher, Miss Brown, when on a certain occasion, being present at a school examination, I overheard her commenting to a lady upon Gertrude's wonderful promise, in person as well as in mind. Whether the first part of this promise has been fulfilled, I have no means of judging. But as I recall her dignified and graceful little figure, her large, intelligent, sparkling eyes, the glow of feeling that lit up her whole countenance, and the peaceful, almost majestic expression which purity of soul imparted to her yet childish figures, she stands forth to my remembrance the embodiment of all that I hold most dear. 6 years may have outwardly changed her much, but they cannot have robbed her of what I prize the most. She has charms over which time can have no power, a grace that is a gift of heaven, a beauty that is eternal. Could I ask for more? Do not believe, then," continued he, after a short pause, "that my fidelity to my early playmate is an emotion of gratitude merely. It is true I owe her much, far more than I can ever repay, but the honest warmth of my affection for the noble girl springs from the truest love of a purity of character and singleness of heart which I have never seen equaled. What is there in the wearisome and foolish walks of fashion, the glitter and show of wealth, the homage of an idle crowd, that could so fill my heart, elevate my spirit, and inspire my exertions, as the thought of a peaceful, happy home, blessed by a presiding spirit so formed for confidence, love, and a communion that time can never dissolve and eternity will but render more secure and unbroken." "And she, whom you love so well, are you sure?" asked Mr. Phillips, speaking with visible effort, and faltering ere he had completed his sentence. "No," answered Willie, anticipating the question. "I know what you would ask. I am not sure. I have no reason to indulge the hopes I have been dwelling upon so fondly, but I do not regret having spoken with such openness and candor. For, should she grieve my heart by her coldness, I should still be proud to have loved her. Until this time, ever since I gained my native land, I have been shackled with duties, which, sacred as they were, have chafed a spirit longing for freedom to follow its own impulses. In this visit to you, sir," and, as he spoke, he rose to depart, "I have fulfilled the last obligation imposed upon me by my excellent friend, and to-morrow I shall be at liberty to go where duty alone prevented me from at once hastening." He offered his hand to Mr. Emery, who grasped it with a cordiality very different from the feeble greeting he had given him on his entrance. "Good bye," said he. "You carry with you my best wishes for a success which you seem to have so much at heart. But some day or other I feel sure you will be reminded of all I have said to you this evening." Strange man, thought Willie, as he walked towards his own hotel. How warmly he shook my hand at parting, and with what a friendly manner he bade me farewell, notwithstanding the coldness of the reception he gave me, and the pertinacity with which, throughout my whole visit, I rejected his opinions and repelled his advice. End of chapter 44. Chapter 45 of The Lamplighter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bridget Gaige. The Lamplighter by Maria Susanna CUMMINS. Chapter 45. Yet 'tis a weary task to school the heart, ere years of grief have tamed its fiery spirit, into that still and passive fortitude which is but learned from suffering. Hemans. "Miss Gertrude?" said Mrs. Prime, opening the parlor door, putting her head cautiously in, looking round, and then advancing with a stealthy pace, like that of a favorite family cat which is venturing to step a little beyond its usual limits. "My, how busy you are! Lor' sakes alive, if you ain't rippin' up them great curtains of Miss Graham's for the wash. I wouldn't be botherin' with 'em, Miss Graham. She won't be here for this fortnight, and Miss Alice will have time enough." "Oh, I have nothing else to do, Mrs. Prime. It's no trouble." Then, looking up pleasantly at the old cook, she added, "It seems very cozy for us all to be at home again, doesn't it?" "It seems beautiful," answered Mrs. Prime, with emphasis, "and I hope there's no harm in sayin' it, I can't help thinkin' how nice it would be if we could all live on just as we are now, without no more intrusions." Gertrude smiled and said, "Everything looks as it used to in old times, when I first came here. I was quite a child then," continued she, with a sigh. "Gracious me! What are you now?" said Mrs. Prime. For mercy's sakes, Miss Gertrude, don't you begin to think about growin' old. There's nothin' like feelin' young to keep young. There's Miss Patty Pace, now." "I have been meaning to ask after her," exclaimed Gertrude, resuming her scissors, and commencing to rip out another window curtain. "Is she alive and well yet?" "She?" replied Mrs. Prime. "Lor', she won't never die. Old women like her, that feels themselves young gals, allers live for ever. But I came a purpose to speak to you about her. The baker's boy that fetched the loaves, this mornin', brought an errant from her, and she wants to see you the first chance she can get. But I wouldn't hurry, either, about going there, or anywhere, Miss Gertrude, till I got rested. For I believe you ain't well, and you look so spent, and kind o' tired out." "Did she wish to see me?" asked Gertrude. "Poor old thing! I'll go and see her, this very afternoon. And you needn't feel anxious about me, Mrs. Prime. I am quite well." And Gertrude went. It was now her second day of suspense, and this, like every other motive for action, was eagerly hailed. She found Miss Patty nearly bent double with rheumatism, dressed with less than her usual care, and crouching over a miserable fire built of a few chips and shavings. She appeared, however, to be in tolerable spirits, and hailed Gertrude's entrance by a cordial greeting. The curiosity for which she was always remarkable seemed to have increased, rather than diminished, with the infirmities of age. Innumerable were the questions she put to Gertrude regarding her own personal experiences during the past year, and the movements of the circles in which she had been living. She showed a special interest in Saratoga life, the latest fashions exhibited there, and the opportunities which the place afforded for forming advantageous matrimonial connections. "So you have not yet chosen a companion," said she, after Gertrude had patiently and good-naturedly responded to all her queries. "That is a circumstance to be regretted. Not," continued she, with a little smirk and a slight wave of the hand, "that it is ever too late in life for one to meditate the conjugal tie, which is often assumed with advantage by persons of 50 or more. And certainly you, who are still in the bloom of your days, need not despair of a youthful swain. However, existence, I may say, is twofold when it is shared with a congenial partner. And I had hoped that before now, Miss Gertrude, both you and myself would have formed such an alliance. Experience prompts me, when I declare the protection of the matrimonial union one of its greatest advantages." "I hope you have not suffered from the want of it," said Gertrude. "I have, Miss Gertrude, suffered incalculably. Let me impress upon you, however, that the keenest pangs have been those of the sensibilities. Yes, the sensibilities, the finest part of our nature, and that which will least bear wounding." "I am sorry to hear that you have been thus grieved," said Gertrude. "I should have supposed that, living quite alone, you might have been spared this trial." "Oh, Miss Gertrude!" exclaimed the old lady, lifting up both hands, and speaking in such a pitiable tone as would have excited the compassion of her listener, if it had been one grain less ridiculous. "Oh, that I had the wings of a dove, wherewith to flee away from my kindred! I fondly thought to have distanced them, but within the last revolving year they have discovered my retreat, and I can no longer elude their vigilance. Hardly can I recover from the shock of one visitation, made, as I am convinced, for the sole purpose of taking an inventory of my possessions and measuring the length of my days, before the vultures are again seen hovering round my dwelling. But," exclaimed the old lady, raising her voice and inwardly chuckling as she spoke, "they shall fall into their own snare, for I will dupe every one of them yet." "I was not aware that you had any relations," said Gertrude, "and it seems they are such only in name." "Name!" said Miss Pace, emphatically. "I am animated with gladness at the thought that they are not honoured with a cognomen which not one of them is worthy to bear. No, they pass by a different name, a name as plebeian as their own coarse souls. There are 3 of them, who stand to each other in a fraternal relation, and all are alike hateful to me. One, a contemptible coxcomb, comes here to overawe me with his presence, which he conceives to be imposing, calls me aunt, aunt, thus testifying by his speech to a consanguinity which he blindly fancies makes him nearer akin to my property. The old lady, excited to wrath, almost shrieked the last word. And the other 2," continued she, with equal heat, "are beggars. Always were, always will be. Let 'em be. I'm glad of it." "You hear me, Miss Gertrude. You are a young lady of quick comprehension, and I avail myself of your contiguity, which, although you deny the charge, may shortly be interrupted by some eager lover, to request at your hands a favor, such as I little thought once I should ever feel compelled to seek. I want you I sent for you to write," Miss Patty lowered her voice to a whisper, "the last will and testament of Miss Patty Pace." The poor woman's trembling voice evidenced a deep compassion for herself, which Gertrude could not help sharing, and she expressed a willingness to comply with her wishes as far as was in her power, at the same time declaring her utter ignorance of all the forms of law. To Gertrude's astonishment, Miss Patty announced her own perfect acquaintance with all the legal knowledge which the case demanded, and in so complete and faultless a manner did she dictate the words of the important instrument, that being afterwards properly witnessed, signed, and sealed, it was found at the end of a few months, at which time Miss Patty was called upon to give up her earthly trust, free from imperfection and flaw, and proved a satisfactory direction for the disposal of the inheritance. It may be as well to state here, however, that he who was pronounced sole heir to her really valuable property never availed himself of the bequest, otherwise than to make a careful bestowal of it among the most needy and worthy of her relatives. Notwithstanding the protestations of several respectable individuals, who were present at the attestation of the document, all of whom pronounced Miss Patty sane and collected to her last moments, he never would believe that a sound mind could have made so wild and erratic a disposal of the hardly earned and carefully preserved savings of years. This sole inheritor of her estates was William Sullivan, the knight of the rosy countenance, and the same chivalrous spirit which won Miss Patty's virgin heart and gained for him her lasting favor, prompted him to disclaim and utterly refuse the acceptance of a reward so wholly disproportioned to the slight service he had rendered the old lady. Though he could not fail to be amused, he was nevertheless deeply touched by the preamble to the will, in which Miss Patty set forth in a most characteristic manner the feelings and motives which had influenced her in the choice of an heir to her possessions. A gentlewoman of advanced years, who has clung to life and its hopes, and, in spite of many vexatious vicissitudes, feels something loath to depart, has been forcibly reminded by her relations that ere another smiling springtime she may have a call to join the deceased lines of Paces, a family which will, on her departure, here become extinct. With the most polite of courtesies, and a passing wave of the hand, Miss Patty acknowledges the forethought of her relations of the other branch, in reminding her, before it be too late, of the propriety of naming the individual for whose benefit it is her desire to make a testamentary provision. She has looked about the world, viewed all her fellows in the glass of memory, and made her final election. The youth himself, the most gallant young gentleman of his day, will open his eyes in astonishment and declare, "Madam, I know you not." But, sir, Miss Patty, old, ugly, and infirm, has a heart which feels as keenly as it did in youth. She has not forgotten, she means now to signify, by her last deeds, how vividly she remembers. The rosy-cheeked youth who once raised her from the frosty earth, took her withered hand, placed it within his vigorous young arm, and with sunny smiles and cheering words escorted the rheumatic old woman to a refuge from the wintry elements. Miss Patty has a natural love of courtesy and the deference offered by gay and beautiful youth to helpless and despised age has touched a sensitive chord. Miss Patty, it is no secret, has some little hoarded treasures, and, since she cannot be on the spot to superintend their expenditure, she has, after some struggles, resolved to secure them from pollution by awarding these savings of years to one possessed of such true gentility as Master William Sullivan, confidently assured that he will never disgrace the former owner of the property, or permit her wealth to flow into vulgar channels. Then followed an inventory of the estate, a most remarkable estate, consisting of odds and ends of everything, and finally a carefully and legally worded document, assigning the whole of the strange medley, without legacies or encumbrances, to the sole use and disposal of the appointed heir. Gertrude found it no easy task to gather and transfix in writing the exact idea which the old woman's rambling dictation was intended to convey, and it was 2 or 3 hours before the manuscript was completed, and the patient and diligent scribe permitted to depart. The sky was overcast, and a drizzling rain beginning to fall as she commenced walking towards home, but the distance was not great, and the only damage she sustained was a slight dampness to her garments. Emily perceived it at once, however. "Your dress is quite wet," said she. "You must go and sit by the parlour fire. I shall not go down until tea time, but father is there, and will be glad of your company. He has been alone all the afternoon." Gertrude found Mr. Graham sitting in front of a pleasant wood fire, half dozing, half reading. She took a book and a low chair, and joined him. Finding the heat too great, however, she soon retreated to a sofa, at the opposite side of the room. Hardly had she done so when there was a ring at the front door bell. The housemaid, who was passing by the door, opened it, and immediately ushered in a visitor. It was Willie. Gertrude rose, but trembling from head to foot, so that she dared not trust herself to take a step forward. Willie advanced into the centre of the room, then looked at Gertrude, bowed, hesitated, and said, "Miss Flint, is she here?" The colour rushed into Gertrude's face. She attempted to speak, but failed. It was not necessary, the blush was enough. Willie recognized her, and starting forward, eagerly seized her hand. "Gertie, is it possible?" The perfect naturalness and case of his manner, the warmth and earnestness with which he took and retained her hand, reassured the agitated girl. The spell seemed partially removed. For a moment he became in her eyes the Willie of old, her dear friend and playmate, and she found voice to exclaim, "Oh, Willie, you have come at last! I am so glad to see you!" The sound of their voices disturbed Mr. Graham, who had fallen into a nap, from which the ringing of the doorbell and the entrance of a strange step had failed to arouse him. He turned round in his easy chair, then rose. Willie dropped Gertrude's hand, and stepped towards him. "Mr. Sullivan," said Gertrude, with a feeble attempt at a suitable introduction. They shook hands, and then all three sat down. And now all Gertrude's embarrassment returned. It is not unfrequently the case that when the best of friends meet after a long separation they salute or embrace each other, and then, notwithstanding the weight of matter pressing on the mind of each, sufficient perhaps to furnish subjects of conversation for weeks to come, nothing of importance presents itself at once, and a pause ensues, which is finally filled up by some most trivial and unimportant question concerning the journey of the newly arrived party or the safety of his baggage. But to these latter questions, or any of a similar nature, Gertrude required no answer. She had seen Willie before. She was aware of his arrival, knew even the steamer in which he had come, but was anxious to conceal from him this knowledge. She could not tell him, since he seemed so ignorant of the fact himself that they had met before, and it may well be imagined that she was at an utter loss what to do or say, under the circumstances. Her embarrassment soon communicated itself to Willie, and Mr. Graham's presence, which was a restraint to both, made matters worse. Willie, however, first broke the momentary silence. "I should hardly have known you, Gertrude. I did not know you. How did you come?" asked Mr. Graham, abruptly, apparently unconscious that he was interrupting Willie's remark. "In the Europa," replied Willie. "She got into New York about a week ago." "Out here, I meant," said Mr. Graham, rather stiffly. "Did you come out in the coach?" "Oh, excuse me, sir," rejoined Willie. "I misunderstood you. No, I drove out from Boston in a chaise." "Did any one take your horse?" "I fastened him in front of the house." Willie glanced out of the window, it was now nearly dusk, to see that the animal was still where he had left him. Mr. Graham settled himself in his easy chair, and looked into the fire. There was another pause, more painful than the first. "You are changed, too," said Gertrude, at last, in reply to Willie's unfinished comment. Then, fearing he might feel hurt at what he must know to be true in more ways than one, the colour, which had retreated, mounted once more to her cheeks. He did not seem to feel hurt, however, but replied, "Yes, an Eastern climate makes great changes, but I think I can hardly have altered more than you have. Why, only think, Gertie, you were a child when I went away. I suppose I must have known I should have found you a young lady, but I begin to think I never fully realized it." "When did you leave Calcutta?" "The latter part of February. I passed the spring months in Paris." "You did not write," said Gertrude, in a faltering voice. "No, I was expecting to come across by every steamer, and wanted to surprise you." Conscious that she had probably seemed far less surprised than he expected, she looked confused, but replied, "I was very disappointed about the letters, but I am very glad to see you again, Willie." "You can't be so glad as I am," said he, lowering his voice, and looking at her with great tenderness. "You seem more and more like yourself to me every minute that I see you." I begin to think, however, that I ought to have written and told you I was coming." Gertrude smiled. Willie's manner was so unchanged, his words so affectionate, that it seemed unkind to doubt his friendliness, although to his undivided love she felt she could have no claim. "No," said she, "I like surprises. Don't you remember, I always did?" "Remember? Certainly," replied he. "I have never forgotten anything that you liked." Just at this moment Gertrude's birds, whose cage hung in the window at which Willie sat, commenced a little twittering noise, which they always made just at night. He looked up. "Your birds," said Gertrude, "the birds you sent me." "Are they all alive and well?" asked he. "Yes, all of them." "You have been a kind mistress to the little things. They are very tender." "I am very fond of them." "You take such care of those you love, dear Gertie, that you are sure to preserve their lives as long as they may be." His tone, still more than his words, betrayed the deep meaning with which he spoke. Gertrude was silent. "Is Miss Graham well?" asked Willie. Gertrude related, in reply, that her nerves had been recently much disturbed by the terrible experiences through which she had passed, and this led to the subject of the recent disaster, at which Gertrude forbore to mention her having been herself present. Willie spoke with feeling of the sad catastrophe, and with severity of the reckless carelessness which had been the cause of it, and ended by remarking that he had valued friends on board the boat, but was unaware that Miss Graham, whom he loved for Gertrude's sake, was among them. Conversation between Gertrude and Willie had by this time assumed a footing of ease, and something of their former familiarity. The latter had taken a seat near her on the sofa, that they might talk more restrainedly; for, although Mr. Graham might have dropped asleep again, for anything they knew to the contrary, it was not easy wholly to forget his presence. There were many subjects, however, on which it would have seemed natural for them to speak, had not Gertrude purposely avoided them. The causes of Willie's sudden return, his probable stay, his future plans in life, and especially his reasons for having postponed his visit to herself until he had been in the country more than a week. All these were inquiries which even ordinary interest and curiosity would have suggested, but to Gertrude they all lay under embargo. She neither felt prepared to receive, nor willing to force his confidence on matters which must inevitably be influenced by his engagement with Miss Clinton, and therefore preserved utter silence on these topics, even taking pains to avoid them. And Willie, deeply grieved at this strange want of sympathy on her part, forbore to thrust upon her notice these seemingly forgotten or neglected circumstances. They talked of Calcutta life, of Parisian novelties, of Gertrude's school-keeping, and many other things, but spoke not a word of matters which lay nearest to the hearts of both. At length a servant appeared at the door, and, not observing that there was company, announced tea. Mr. Graham rose, and stood with his back to the fire. Willie rose also, and prepared to take leave. Mr. Graham, with frigid civility, urged him to remain, and Gertrude hesitated not to urge him to do so; but he declined with such decision that the latter understood plainly that he perceived and felt the neglect with which Mr. Graham had treated him and his visit. In addition to the fact that the old gentleman disliked young man as a class, and that Willie had intruded upon the rare and sacred privacy in which he was indulging, there was the bitter and still rankling recollection that Gertrude had once forsaken himself and Emily, for so he, in his own mind, styled her conscientious choice between conflicting duties, for the very family of which their visitor was the only remaining member, a recollection which did not tend to soften or conciliate the easily prejudiced and obstinate-minded man. Gertrude accompanied Willie to the door. The rain had ceased, but the wind whistled across the piazza. It seemed to be growing cold. Willie buttoned his coat, while he promised to see Gertrude on the following day. "You have no overcoat," said she. "The night is chilly, and you are accustomed to a hot climate. You had better take this shawl." And she took from the hat tree a heavy Scotch plaid, which always hung there to be used on occasions like the present. He thanked her, and threw it over his arm. Then, taking both her hands in his, looked her steadily in the face for a moment, as if he would fain have spoken. Seeing, however, that she shrank from his mild and affectionate gaze, he dropped her hands, and with a troubled expression bade her good night, and ran down the door-steps. Gertrude stood with the handle of the door in her hand until she heard the sound of his horse's hoofs as he drove down the road, then, hastily shutting it, ran and hid herself in her own room. Well as she had borne up during the longed-for and yet much dreaded meeting, calmly and naturally as she had sustained her part. Her courage all forsook her now, and in looking forward to days, weeks, and months of frequent intercourse, she felt that the most trying part of the struggle was yet to come. Had Willie been wholly changed, had he seemed the thoughtless worldling, the fashionable man of society, the cold-hearted devotee of business or of gain, in one of which characters she had lately half fancied he would appear, had he greeted her with chilling formality, with heartless indifference, or with awkward restraint, she might, while she despised, pitied, or blamed, have learned to love him less. But he had come back as he went, open-hearted, generous, manly, and affectionate. He had manifested the same unaffected warmth of feeling, the same thoughtful tenderness, he had ever shown. In short, he was the Willie she had thought of, dreamed of, imagined, and loved. It was evident that in giving his heart to another he had never wholly forgotten her. While he loved Isabel, he would still feel a friendly, almost a brotherly regard for Gertrude. More than that it had never occurred to him to bestow. And she must school herself to the cruel task of seeing him day by day, hearing the story of his love for another, and wishing him all joy, as a sister might do a kind and affectionate brother. She must learn to subdue the love whose depth and intensity she had scarcely known until now, and mold it into friendship. As she thought of all this, she found it impossible to still the wildly beating waves that swelled against her aching, throbbing heart. She threw herself upon the bed, buried her face in pillows, and wept. Presently there was a light tap at her door. Believing it to be a summons to the tea-table, she said, without rising, "Jane, is that you? I do not wish for any supper." "It isn't that, miss," said the girl, "but I have brought you a letter." Gertrude sprung up and opened the door. "A little boy handed it to me, and then ran off as fast as he could," said the girl, placing a package in her hand. "He told me to give it to you straight away." "Bring me a lamp," said Gertrude. The girl went for a lamp. Gertrude, in the meantime, endeavoring to judge what a package of such unusual size and thickness could contain. She thought it impossible that any letter could so soon arrive from Mr. Amory. The next morning was the earliest time at which she had expected one. Who then could it be from? And while she was wondering, Jane brought a lamp, by the light of which she at once detected his handwriting, and breaking the seal, she drew from the envelope several closely written pages, whose contents she perused with all the eagerness and excitement which the weight, import, and intense interest of the subject might well demand. End of chapter 45. Chapter 46 of The Lamplighter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bridget Gaige. The Lamplighter by Maria Susanna CUMMINS. Chapter 46. There are swift hours in life, strong, rushing hours, that do the work of tempests in their might. Hemans. It ran as follows: My daughter, my loving, tender-hearted girl, now that your own words encourage me with the assurance that my worst fear was unfounded, the fear that my name was already blasted to your young ears, and your father doomed by your young heart to infamy, now that I can appeal to you as to an impartial witness, I will disclose the story of my life, and, while I prove to you your parentage, will hope that my unprejudiced child, at least, will believe, love, and trust her father, in spite of a world's injustice. I will conceal nothing. I will plunge at once into those disclosures which I most dread to utter, and trust to after explanation to palliate the darkness of my tale. Mr. Graham is my stepfather, and my blessed mother, long since dead, was, in all but the tie of nature, a true mother to Emily. Thus allied, however, to those whom you love best, I am parted from them by a heavy curse, for not only was mine the ill-fated hand, oh, hate me not yet, Gertrude, which locked poor Emily up in darkness, but, in addition to that horrid deed, I stand accused in the eyes of my fellow men of another crime, deep, dark, and disgraceful. And yet, though living under a ban, wandering up and down the world, a doomed and broken-hearted man, I am innocent as a child of all intentional wrong, as you will learn, if you can trust to the truth of the tale I am about to tell. Nature gave and education fostered in me a rebellious spirit. I was the idol of my invalid mother, who, though she loved me with a love for which I bless her memory, had not the energy to tame and subdue the passionate and wilful nature of her boy. Though ungoverned, however, I was neither cruelly nor viciously disposed. And though my sway at home and among my schoolfellows was alike indisputable, I made many friends, and not a single enemy. But a sudden check was at length put to my freedom. My mother married, and I soon came to feel, and feel bitterly, the check which her husband, Mr. Graham, was likely to impose upon my boyish independence. Had he treated me with kindness, had he won my affection, which he might easily have done, for my sensitive and impassioned nature disposed me to every tender and grateful emotion, it is impossible to measure the influence he might have had in moulding my yet unformed character. But the reverse was the case. His behavior towards me was that of chilling coldness and reserve. He repelled with scorn the first advance on my part, which led me, at my mother's instigation, to address him by the paternal title, an offence of which I never again was guilty. And yet, while he seemed to ignore the relationship, he assumed its privileges and authority, thus wounding my feelings and my pride, and exciting a spirit of rebellious opposition to his commands. Two things served to embitter my sentiments and strengthen my growing dislike for my overbearing stepfather. One was the consciousness of my utter dependence upon his bounty. The other, a hint which I received through the mistaken kindness of a domestic who had always known the family, that Mr. Graham's dislike to me had its origin in an old enmity between himself and my own father, an honorable and high-minded man, whom it was ever my great pride to be told that I resembled. Great, however, as was the warfare in my heart, power rested with Mr. Graham, for I was yet but a child, and necessarily subject to government. Nor could I be deaf to my mother's entreaties, that for her sake I would learn submission. It was only occasionally, therefore, when I had been, as I considered, most unjustly thwarted, that I broke forth into direct rebellion, and even then there were influences ever at work to preserve at least outward harmony in our household. Thus years passed on, and though I did not learn to love Mr. Graham more, the force of habit, the intense interest afforded by my studies, and a growing capability of self-control, rendered my mode of life far less obnoxious to me than it had once been. There was one great compensation for my trials, and that was the love I cherished for Emily, who responded to it with equal warmth on her part. It was not because she stood between me and her father, a mediator and a friend. It was not because she submitted patiently to my dictation and aided me in all my plans. It was because our natures were made for each other, and as they grew and expanded, were bound together by ties which a rude hand only could snap and rend asunder. I pause not to dwell upon the tenderness and depth of this affection. It is enough to say that it became the life of my life. At length my mother died. I was at that time, sorely against my will, employed in Mr. Graham's counting-house, and still continued an inmate of his family. And now, without excuse, or even warning, my stepfather commenced a course of policy as unwise as it was cruel, and so irritating to my pride, so torturing to my feelings, and so maddening to my hot nature, that it excited and angered me almost to frenzy. He tried to rob me of the only thing that sweetened and blessed my existence, the love of Emily. I will not here recount the motives I imputed to him, nor the means he employed. It is sufficient to say that they were such as to change my former dislike into bitter hatred, my unwilling obedience to his will into open and deliberate opposition. Instead of submitting to what I considered his tyrannical interference, I sought Emily's society on all occasions, and persuaded the gentle girl to lend herself to my schemes for thwarting her father's purposes. I did not speak to her of love. I did not seek to bind her to me by promises. I hinted not at marriage. A sense of honor forbade it. But with a boyish independence, which I have since feared was the height of folly and imprudence, I sought every occasion, even in her father's presence, to manifest my determination to maintain that constant freedom and familiarity of intercourse which had been the growth of circumstances, and could not, without force, be restrained. At length Emily was taken ill, and for 6 weeks I was debarred from her presence. As soon as she was sufficiently recovered to leave her room, I constantly sought and at last obtained an opportunity to see and speak with her. We had been together in the library more than an hour, when Mr. Graham suddenly entered, and came towards us with a face whose harshness and severity I shall not soon forget. I did not heed an interruption, for the probable consequences of which I believed myself prepared. I was little prepared, however, for the nature of the attack actually made upon me. That he would accuse me of disobedience to wishes which he had hinted in every possible way, and even intimate more plainly than before his resolve to place barriers between Emily and myself, I fully expected, and was ready with my replies. But when he burst forth with a torrent of unqualified and ungentlemanly abuse, when he stormed and raved, imputing to me mean, selfish, and contemptible motives, which had never for a moment influenced me, or even occurred to my mind, I was struck dumb with surprise, impatience, and anger. But this was not all. It was then, in the presence of the pure-minded girl whom I worshipped, that he charged me with a dark and horrid crime, the crime of forgery, asserting my guilt as recently discovered, but positive and undoubted. My spirit had raged before, now it was on fire. I lifted my hand and clenched my fist. What I would have done, I know not. Whether I should have found words to assert my innocence, fling back the lie, and refute a charge as unexpected as it was false, or whether, my voice failing me from passion, I should have swept Mr. Graham from my path, perhaps felled him to the floor, while I strode away to rally my calmness in the open air, I cannot now conjecture. For a wild shriek from Emily recalled me to myself, and turning, I saw her fall fainting upon the sofa. Forgetting everything, then, but the apparently dying condition into which the horror of the scene had thrown her, I sprung forward to her relief. There was a table beside her, and some bottles upon it. I hastily snatched what I believed to be a simple restorative, and in my agitation emptied the contents of the phial in her face. I know not what the exact character of the mixture could have been, but it matters not. Its effect was too awfully evident. The deed was done, the fatal deed, and mine was the hand that did it. Brought suddenly to consciousness by the intolerable torture that succeeded, the poor girl sprung screaming from the sofa, flung her arms wildly above her head, rushed in a frantic manner through the room, and finally crouched in a corner. I followed, in an agony scarce less than her own, but she repelled me with her hands, at the same time uttering piercing shrieks. Mr. Graham, who for an instant had looked like one paralyzed by the scene, now rushed forward like a madman. Instead of aiding me in my efforts to lift poor Emily from the floor, and so far from compassionating my situation, which was only less pitiable than hers, he, with a fierceness redoubled at my being, as he considered, the sole cause of the disaster, attacked me with a storm of jeering taunts and cruel reproaches, declaring that I had killed his child. With words like these, which are still ringing in my ears, he drove me from the room and the house, a repulsion which I, overpowered by the misery of contrition and remorse, had neither the wish nor the strength to resist. Oh, the terrible night and day that succeeded! I can give you no idea how they were passed. I wandered out into the country, spent the whole night walking beneath the open sky, endeavoring to collect my thoughts and compose my mind, and still morning found me with a fevered pulse and excited brain. With the returning light, however, I began to realize the necessity of forming some future plan of action. Emily's sad situation, and my intense anxiety to learn the worst effects of the fatal accident, gave me the strongest motives for hastening, with the earliest morning, either openly or by stealth, to Mr. Graham's house. Everything also which I possessed, all my money, consisting merely of the residue of my last quarter's allowance, my clothing, and a few valuable gifts from my mother, were in the chamber which I had there occupied. There seemed, therefore, to be no other recourse for me than to return thither once more, at least, and having thus resolved, I retraced my steps to the city, determined, if it were necessary in order to gain the desired particulars concerning Emily, to meet her father face to face. As I drew near the house, however, I hesitated, and dared not proceed. Mr. Graham had exhausted upon me already every angry word, had threatened even deeds of violence, should I ever again cross his threshold, and I feared to trust my own fiery spirit to a collision in which I might be led on to an open resistance of the man whom I had already sufficiently injured. In the terrible work I had but yesterday done, a work of whose fatal effect I had even then a gloomy foreshadowing, I had blighted the existence of his worshipped child, and drawn a dark pall over his dearest hopes. It was enough. I would not for worlds be guilty of the added sin of lifting my hand against the man, who, unjust as he had been towards an innocent youth, had met a retaliation far, far too severe. Still, I knew his wrath to be unmitigated, as well aware of his power to excite my hot nature to frenzy, and resolved to beware how I crossed his path. Meet him I must, to refute the false charges he had brought against me, but not within the walls of his dwelling, the home of his suffering daughter. In the counting house, where the crime of forgery was said to have been committed, and in the presence of my fellow clerks, I would publicly deny the deed, and dare him to its proof. But first I must either see or hear from Emily, before I met the father at all. I must learn the exact nature and extent of the wrong I had done him in the person of his child. For this, however, I must wait, until, under cover of the next night's darkness, I could enter the house unperceived. So I wandered about all day in torment, without tasting or even desiring food or rest, the thought of my poor darling tortured Emily ever present to my wretched thoughts. The hours seemed interminable. I remembered that day of suspense as if it had been a whole year of misery. But night came at last, cloudy, and the air thickened with a heavy fog, which, as I approached the street where Mr. Graham lived, enveloped the neighborhood, and concealed the house until I was directly opposite to it. I shuddered at the sight of the physician's chaise standing before the door, for I knew that Dr. Jeremy had closed his visits to Emily more than a week previously, and must have been summoned to attend her since the accident. Finding him there, and thinking it probable Mr. Graham was also in the house at this hour, I forbore to enter, but stood effectually concealed by the cloud of mist, and watching my opportunity. Once or twice Mrs. Ellis, the housekeeper, passed up and down the staircase, as I could distinctly see through the side lights of the door, which afforded me a full view of the entryway; and presently Dr. Jeremy descended slowly, followed by Mr. Graham. The doctor would have passed hastily out, but Mr. Graham detained him, to question him regarding his patient, as I judged from the deep anxiety depicted on my stepfather's countenance, while, with one hand resting on the shoulder of this old friend of the family, he sought to read his opinion in his face. The doctor's back was towards me, and I could only judge of his replies by the effect they produced on the questioner, whose haggard, worn appearance became more fearfully distressed at every syllable that fell from the honest and truthful lips of the medical man, whose words were oracles to all who knew his skill. I needed, therefore, no further testimony to force upon me the conviction that Emily's fate was sealed; and, as I looked with pity upon the afflicted parent, and shudderingly thought how immediate had been my agency in the work of destruction, I felt that the unhappy father could not curse me more bitterly than I cursed myself. Deeply, however, as I mourned, and have never ceased to repent, my share in the exciting of that storm wherein the girl had been so cruelly shipwrecked, I could not forget the part that Mr. Graham had borne in the transaction, or forgive the wicked injustice and insults which had so unnerved and unmanned me as to render my hand a fit instrument only of ruin. And as, immediately after the doctor's departure, I watched my stepfather also come down the steps and walk away, and saw, by a street lamp, that the look of pain had passed from his face, giving place to his usual composed, self-complacent, and arrogant expression, and understood by the loud and measured manner in which he struck his cane upon the pavement, that he was far from sharing my humble penitent mood, I ceased to waste upon him a compassion which he seemed so little to require or deserve, and pitying myself only, I looked upon his stern face with a soul which cherished him for no other sentiment than that of unmitigated hatred. Do not shrink from me, Gertrude, as you read this frank confession of my passionate, and at that moment deeply stirred nature. You know not perhaps what it is to hate, but have you ever been tried as I was? As Mr. Graham turned the corner of the street, I approached his house, drew forth a pass key of my own, by means of which I opened the door, and went in. It was perfectly quiet within, and no person was to be seen in any of the lower rooms. I then passed noiselessly upstairs, and entered a little chamber at the head of the passage, which communicated with Emily's room. I waited here a long time, hearing no sound and seeing no one. At length, fearing that Mr. Graham would shortly return, I determined to ascend to my own room, which was in the next story, collect my money and a few articles of value, which I was unwilling to leave behind, and then make my way to the kitchen and gain what news I could of Emily from Mrs. Prime, the cook, a kind-hearted woman, who would, I felt sure, befriend me. The first part of my object was accomplished, and I had descended the back staircase to gain Mrs. Prime's premises, when I suddenly encountered Mrs. Ellis coming from the kitchen, with a bowl of gruel in her hand. This woman was a recent addition to the household, introduced there a few weeks before as a spy upon my actions, and intolerable to me on that account. She was well acquainted with all the particulars of the accident, and had been a witness to my expulsion from the house. She stopped short on seeing me, gave a slight scream, dropped the bowl of gruel, and prepared to make her escape, as if from a wild beast, which I doubt not that I resembled, since wretchedness, fasting, suffering, and desperation must all have been depicted in my features. I placed myself in her path, and compelled her to stop and listen to me. But before my eager questions could find utterance, an outburst from her confirmed my worst fears. "Let me go!" she exclaimed. "You villain, you will be putting my eyes out next." "Where is Emily?" I cried. "Let me see her." "See her!" replied she. "You horrid wretch! No, she has suffered enough from you. She is satisfied herself now, so let her alone." "What do you mean?" shouted I, shaking the housekeeper violently by the shoulder, for her words seared my very soul, and I was frantic. "Mean!" continued she. "I mean that Emily will never see anybody again, and if she had 1,000 eyes, you are the last person upon whom she would wish to look." "Does Emily hate me too?" burst from me then, in the form of a soliloquy rather than a question. The reply was ready, however. "Hate you? Yes, more than that. She cannot find words that are bad enough for you. She mutters, even in her pain, 'Cruel, wicked,' and so on. She even shudders at the sound of your name, and we are all forbidden to speak it in her presence." I waited to hear no more, but turning, rushed out of the house. That moment was the crisis of my life. The thunderbolt had fallen upon and crushed me. My hopes, my happiness, my fortune, my good name, had gone before, but one solitary light had, until now, glimmered in the darkness. It was Emily's love. I had trusted in that only. It had passed away, and with it my youth, my faith, my hope of heaven. I was a blank on the earth, and cared not whither I went, or what became of me. From that moment I ceased to be myself. Then fell upon me the cloud in which I have ever since been shrouded, and under the shadow of which you have seen and known me. In that instant the blight had come, under the gnawing influence of which my happy laugh changed to the bitter smile, my frank and pleasant speech to tones of ill-concealed irony and sarcasm. My hair became prematurely gray, my features sharp, and oftentimes severe. My fellow men, to whom it had been my noblest hope to prove some day a benefactor, were henceforth the armed hosts of antagonists, with whom I would wage endless war, and the God whom I had worshipped, whom I had believed in, as a just and faithful friend and avenger. Who was he? Where was he? And why did he not right my cause? What direful and premeditated deed of darkness had I been guilty of, that he should thus desert me? Alas, greatest of all misfortunes, I lost my faith in heaven. I know not what direction I took on leaving Mr. Graham's house. I have no recollection of any of the streets through which I passed, though doubtless they were all familiar, but I paused not, until, having reached the end of a wharf, I found myself gazing down into the deep water, longing to take one mad leap and lose myself in everlasting oblivion. But for this final blow, beneath which my manhood had fallen, I would have cherished my life, at least until I could vindicate its fair name. I would never have left a blackened memory for men to dwell upon, and for Emily to weep over. But now what cared I for my fellow men? And Emily, she had ceased to love, and would not mourn, and I longed for nothingness and the grave. There are moments in human life when a word, a look, or a thought, may weigh down the balance in the scales of fate, and decide a destiny. So it was with me. I was incapable of forming any plan for myself, but accident as it were decided for me. I was startled from the apathy into which I had fallen by the sudden splashing of oars in the water beneath, and in a moment a little boat was moored to a pier within a rod of the spot where I stood. At the same instant I heard quick footsteps on the wharf, and turning, saw by the light of the moon, which was just appearing from behind a heavy cloud, a stout seafaring man, with a heavy pea-jacket under one arm, and an old-fashioned carpet-bag in his left hand. He had a ruddy, good-humored face, and as he approached, and was about to pass me and leap into the boat, where 2 sailors, with their oars dipped and ready for motion, were awaiting him, he slapped me heartily on the shoulder and exclaimed, "Well, my fine fellow, will you ship with us?" I answered as readily in the affirmative, and with one look in my face and a glance at my dress, which seemed to assure him of my station in life, and probable ability to make compensation for the passage, he said in a laughing tone, "In with you, then." To his astonishment, for he had scarcely believed me in earnest, I sprang into the boat, and in a few moments was on board of a fine bark, bound I knew not whither. The vessel's destination proved to be Rio Janeiro, a fact which I did not learn, however, till we had been 2 or 3 days at sea, and to which, even then, I felt wholly indifferent. There was one other passenger beside myself, the captain's daughter, Lucy Gray, whom, during the first week, I scarcely noticed, but who appeared to be as much at home, whether in the cabin or on deck, as if she had passed her whole life at sea. I might, perhaps, have made the entire passage without giving another thought to this young girl, half child, half woman, had not my strange and mysterious behavior led her to conduct in a manner which at first surprised and finally interested me. My wild and excited countenance, my constant restlessness, avoidance of food, and apparent indifference to everything that went on about me, excited her wonder and sympathy to the utmost. She at first believed me partially deranged, and treated me accordingly. She would take a seat on deck directly opposite mine, look in my face for an hour, either ignorant or regardless of my observing her, and then walk away with a heavy sigh. Occasionally she would come and offer me some little delicacy, begging that I would try and eat; and as, touched by her kindness, I took food more readily from her hand than any other, these little attentions became at last habitual. As my manners and looks grew calmer, however, and I settled into a melancholy, which, though equally deep, was less fearful than the feverish torment under which I had labored, she became proportionately reserved, and when at last I began to appear somewhat like my fellow men, went regularly to the table, and instead of pacing the deck all night, spent a part of it, at least, quietly in my stateroom, Lucy absented herself wholly from that part of the vessel where I passed the greater portion of the day, and I seldom exchanged a word with her, unless I purposely sought her society. We experienced much stormy weather, however, which drove me to the cabin, where she usually sat on the transom, reading, or watching the troubled waves, and as the voyage was very long, we were necessarily thrown much in each other's way, especially as Captain Gray, the same individual who had invited me to ship with him, and who seemed still to take an interest in my welfare, good-naturedly encouraged an intercourse by which he probably hoped I might be won from a state of melancholy that seemed to astonish and grieve the jolly shipmaster almost as much as it did his kind-hearted, sensitive child. Lucy's shyness, therefore, wore gradually away, and before our tedious passage was completed I ceased to be a restraint upon her. She talked freely with, or rather to me, for while, notwithstanding her occasional intimations of curiosity, I maintained a rigid silence concerning my own past experiences, of which I could scarcely endure to think, much less to speak, she exerted herself freely for my entertainment, and related, with simple frankness, almost every circumstance of her past life. Sometimes I listened attentively; sometimes, absorbed in my own painful reflections, I would be deaf to her voice, and forgetful of her presence. In the latter case, I would often observe, however, that she had suddenly ceased speaking, and starting from my reverie, and looking quickly up, would find her eyes fixed upon me so reproachfully, that, rallying my self-command, I would endeavor to appear, and not unfrequently really became, seriously interested in the artless narratives of my little entertainer. She told me that until she was 14 years old she lived with her mother in a little cottage on Cape Cod, their home being only occasionally enlivened by the return of her father from his long absences at sea. They would then usually make a visit to the city where his vessel lay, pass a few weeks in uninterrupted enjoyment, and at length return home to mourn the departure of the cheerful, light-hearted sea captain, and patiently count the weeks and months until he would come back again. She told me how her mother died at last, how bitterly she mourned her loss, and how her father wept when he came home and heard the news; how she had lived on shipboard ever since, and how sad and lonely she felt in time of storms, when, the master at his post of duty, she sat alone in the cabin, listening to the roar of wind and waves. Tears would come into her eyes when she spoke of these things, and I would look upon her with pity, as one whom sorrow made my sister. Trial, however, had not yet robbed her of an elastic, buoyant spirit, and when, 5 minutes after the completion of some eloquent little tale of early grief, the captain would approach unseen, and surprise her by a sudden joke, exclamation, or sly piece of mischief, thus provoking her to retaliate, She was always ready and alert for a war of wits, a laughing frolic, or even a game of romps. Her sorrow forgotten, and her tears dried up, her merry voice and her playful words would delight her father, and the cabin or the deck would ring with his joyous peals of laughter; while I, shrinking from a mirth and gaiety sadly at variance with my own unhappiness, and the sound of which was discordant to my sensitive nerves, would retire to brood over miseries for which it was hopeless to expect sympathy, which could not be shared, and with which I must dwell alone. Such a misanthrope had my misfortunes made me, that the sportive raillery between the captain and his merry daughter, and the musical laugh with which he would respond to the occasional witticisms of one or two old and privileged sailors, grated upon my ears like something scarce less than personal injuries; nor could I have believed it possible that one so little able as Lucy to comprehend the depths of my sufferings could feel any sincere compassion for them, had I not once or twice been touched to see how her innocent mirth would give place to sudden gravity and sadness of countenance, if she chanced unexpectedly to encounter my woe-begone face, rendered doubly gloomy when contrasted with the gaiety of herself and her companions. But I must not linger too long upon the details of our life on shipboard, for I have to relate events which occupied many years, and must confine myself, as far as possible, to a concise statement of facts. I must forbear giving any account of a terrific gale that we encountered, during which, for 2 days and a night, poor Lucy was half frantic with fear, while I, careless of outward discomforts, and indifferent to personal danger, was afforded an opportunity to requite her kindness by such protection and encouragement as I was able to render. But this, and various other incidents of the voyage, all bore a part in inspiring her with a degree of confidence in me, which by the time we arrived in port was put to a severe and somewhat embarrassing test. End of chapter 46. Chapter 47 of The Lamplighter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bridget Gaige. The Lamplighter by Maria Susanna Cummins. Chapter 47. Do not spurn me, in my prayer, for this wandering ever longer, evermore, hath overworn me, and I know not on what shore I may rest from my despair. E.B. Browning. Captain Gray died. We were within a week's sail of our destination when he was taken ill, and 3 days before we were safely anchored in the harbor of Rio, he breathed his last. I shared with Lucy the office of ministering to the suffering man, closed his eyes at last, and carried the fainting girl in my arms to another part of the vessel. With kind words and persuasions I restored her to her senses, and then, as the full consciousness of her desolation rushed upon her, she sunk at once into a state of hopeless despondency, more painful to witness than her previous condition of utter insensibility. Captain Gray had made no provision for his daughter. Indeed, it would have been impossible for him to do so, as the state of his affairs afterwards proved. Well might the poor girl lament her sad fate, for she was without a relative in the world, penniless, and approaching a strange shore, which afforded no refuge to the orphan. We buried her father in the sea, and, that sad office fulfilled, I sought Lucy, and endeavored, as I had several times tried to do without success, to arouse her to a sense of her situation, and advise with her concerning the future, for we were now so near our port that in a few hours we might be compelled to leave the vessel and seek quarters in the city. She listened to me without replying. At length I hinted at the necessity of my leaving her, and begged to know if she had any plans for the future. She answered me only by a burst of tears. I expressed the deepest sympathy for her grief, and begged her not to weep. And then, with many sobs, and interrupting herself by frequent outbreaks and exclamations of vehement sorrow, she threw herself upon my compassion, and with unaffected simplicity and childlike artlessness entreated me not to leave, or, as she termed it, to desert her. She reminded me that she was all alone in the world, that the moment she stepped foot on shore she should be in a land of strangers, and, appealing to my mercy, besought me not to forsake and leave her to die alone. What could I do? I had nothing on earth to live for. We were both alike orphaned and desolate. There was but one point of difference. I could work and protect her; she could do neither for herself. It would be something for me to live for; and for her, though but a refuge of poverty and want, It was better than the exposure and suffering that must otherwise await her. I told her plainly how little I had to offer, that my heart even was crushed and broken, but that I was ready to labor in her behalf, to guard her from danger, to pity, and perhaps in time learn to love her. The unsophisticated girl had never thought of marriage. She had sought the protection of a friend, not a husband, but I explained to her that the latter tie only would obviate the necessity of our parting, and in the humility of sorrow she finally accepted my unflattering offer. The only confidant to our sudden engagement, the only witness of the marriage, which within a few hours ensued, was a veteran mariner, an old, weather-beaten sailor, who had known and loved Lucy from her childhood, and whose name will be, perhaps, familiar to you, Ben Grant. He accompanied us on shore, and to the church which was our first destination. He followed us to the humble lodgings with which we contrived for the present to be contented, and devoted himself to Lucy with self-sacrificing, but in one instance, alas! as you will soon learn, with mistaken and fatal zeal. After much difficulty, I obtained employment from a man in whom I accidentally recognized an old and valued friend of my father. He had been in Rio several years, was actively engaged in trade, and willingly employed me as clerk, occasionally dispatching me from home to transact business at a distance. My duties being regular and profitable, we were soon not only raised above want, but I was enabled to place my young wife in a situation that ensured comfort, if not luxury. The sweetness of her disposition, the cheerfulness with which she endured privation, the earnestness with which she strove to make me happy, were not without effect. I perseveringly rallied from my gloom. I succeeded in banishing the frown from my brow, and the premature wrinkles, which her little hand would softly sweep away, finally ceased to return. The few months that I passed with your mother, Gertrude, form a sweet episode in the memory of my stormy life. I came to love her much, not as I loved Emily, that could not be expected, but as the solitary flower that bloomed on the grave of all my early hopes. She cast a fragrance round my path, and her child is not more dear to me because a part of myself than as the memento of the cherished blossom, snatched hastily from my hand and rudely crushed. About 2 months after your birth, my child, and before your eyes had ever learned to brighten at the sight of your father, who was necessarily much from home, the business in which I was engaged called me, in the capacity of an agent, to a station at some distance from Rio. I had been absent nearly a month, and had extended my journey beyond my original intentions, and had written regularly to Lucy, informing her of all my movements, though I have since believed that the letters never reached her, when the neighborhood in which I was stationed became infected with a fatal malaria. For the sake of my family, I took every measure to ward off contagion, but failed. I was seized with the terrible fever, and lay for weeks at the point of death. I was cruelly neglected during my illness, for I had no friends near me, and my slender purse held out little inducement for mercenary service. But my sufferings and forebodings on account of Lucy and yourself were far greater than any which I endured from my bodily torments, though the latter were great indeed. I conjured up every fear that the imagination could conceive, but nothing, alas, which could compare with the reality that awaited me, when, after an almost interminable illness, I made my way, destitute, ragged, and emaciated, back to Rio. I sought my former home. It was deserted, and I was warned to flee from its vicinity, as the fearful disease of which I had already been the prey had nearly depopulated that and the neighboring streets. I made every inquiry, but could obtain no intelligence of my wife and child. I hastened to the horrible charnel house where, during the raging of the pestilence, the unrecognized dead were exposed. But among the disfigured and moldering remains, it was impossible to distinguish friends from strangers. I lingered about the city for weeks, in hopes to gain some information concerning Lucy, but could find no one who had ever heard of her. All day I wandered about the streets and on the wharves, the latter being places which Ben Grant, in whose faithful charge I had left your mother and yourself, was in the habit of frequenting, but not a syllable could I learn of any persons that answered my description. My first thought had been that they would naturally seek my employer, to learn, if possible, the cause of my prolonged absence, and on finding my home empty I had hastened in search of him. But he, too, had, within a recent period, fallen a victim to the prevailing distemper. His place of business was closed, and the establishment broken up, I prolonged my search, and continued my inquiries until hope died within me. I was assured that scarce an inmate of the fatal neighborhood where I had left my family had escaped the withering blast, and convinced finally that my fate was still pursuing me with an unmitigated wrath, of which this last blow was but a single expression, that I might have foreseen and expected, I madly agreed to work my passage in the first vessel which promised me an escape from scenes so fraught with harrowing recollections. And now commenced in truth that course of wretched wandering, which, knowing neither pause nor cessation, has made up the sum of my existence. With varied ends in view, following strongly contrasted employments, and with fluctuating fortune, I have traveled over the world. My feet have trodden almost every land, I have sailed upon every sea, and breathed the air of every clime. I am familiar with the city and the wilderness, the civilized man and the savage. I have learned the sad lesson that peace is nowhere, and friendship for the most part but a name. If I have taught myself to hate, shun, and despise humanity, it is because I know it well. Once, during my wanderings, I visited the home of my boyhood. Unseen and unknown, I trod familiar ground, and gazed on familiar, though time-worn faces. I stood at the window of Mr. Graham's library, saw the contented, happy countenance of Emily, happy in her blindness and her forgetfulness of the past. A young girl sat near the fire, endeavoring to read by its flickering light. I knew not then what gave such a charm to her thoughtful features, nor why my eyes dwelt upon them with a rare pleasure. For there was no voice to proclaim to the father's heart that he looked on the face of his child. I am not sure that the strong impulse which prompted me then to enter, acknowledge my identity, and beg Emily to speak to me a word of forgiveness, might not have prevailed over the dread of her displeasure. But Mr. Graham at the moment made his appearance, cold and implacable as ever. I looked upon him an instant, then fled from the house, and the next day departed for other lands. Although, in the various labors which I was compelled to undertake, to earn for myself a decent maintenance, I had more than once met with such success as to give me temporary independence, and enable me to indulge myself in expensive traveling. I had never amassed a fortune; indeed, I had not cared to do so, since I had no use for money, except to employ it in the gratification of my immediate wants. Accident, however, at last thrust upon me a wealth which I could scarcely be said to have sought. After a year spent in the wilderness of the West, amid adventures the relation of which would seem to you almost incredible, I gradually continued my retreat across the country, and after encountering innumerable hardships in a solitary journey, which had in it no other object than the indulgence of my vagrant habits, I found myself in that land which has recently been termed the land of promise, but which has proved to many a greedy emigrant a land of falsehood and deceit. For me, however, who sought it not, it showered gold. I was among the earliest discoverers of its treasure vaults, one of the most successful, though the least laborious of the seekers after gain. Nor was it merely, or indeed chiefly, at the mines that fortune favored me. With the first results of my labors, I chanced to purchase an immense tract of land, little dreaming at the time that those desert acres were destined to become the streets and squares of a great and prosperous city. So it was, however, and without effort, almost without my knowledge, I achieved the greatness which springs from untold wealth. But this was not all. The blessed accident which led me to this golden land was the means of disclosing a pearl of price, a treasure in comparison with which California and all its mines shrink to my mind into insignificance. You know how the war cry went forth to all lands, and men of every name and nation brought their arms to the field of fortune. Famine came next, with disease and death in its train, and many a man, hurrying on to reap the golden harvest, fell by the wayside, without once seeing the waving of the yellow grain. Half scorning the greedy rabble, I could not refuse, in this my time of prosperity, to minister to the wants of such as fell in my way, and now for once my humanity found its own reward. A miserable, ragged, half-starved, and apparently dying man crept to the door of my tent, for these were the primitive days, when that land afforded no better habitation, and asked in a feeble voice for charity. I did not refuse to admit him into my narrow domicile, and to the extent of my ability relieve his suffering condition. He proved to be the victim of want rather than disease, And, his hunger appeased, the savage brutality of his coarse nature soon manifested itself in the dogged indifference with which he received a stranger's bounty, and the gross ingratitude with which he abused my hospitality. A few days sufficed to restore him to his full strength, and then, anxious to dismiss my visitor, whose conduct had already excited suspicions of his good faith, I gave him warning that he must depart, at the same time placing in his hands a sufficient amount of gold to ensure his support until he could reach the mines, which were his professed destination. He appeared dissatisfied, and begged permission to remain until the next morning, as the night was near, and he had no shelter provided. To this I made no objection, little imagining how base a serpent I was harboring. At midnight, I was awakened from my light and easily disturbed sleep, to find my lodger busily engaged in rifling my property, and preparing to take an unceremonious leave of my dwelling. Nor did his villainy end here. Upon my seizing and charging him with the theft, he snatched a weapon which lay near at hand, and attempted the life of his benefactor. I was prepared, however, to ward off the stroke, and by means of my superior strength succeeded in a few moments in subduing and mastering my desperate antagonist. He now crouched at my feet in such abject and mean submission as might have been expected from so contemptible a knave. Well might he tremble with fear, for the lynch law was then in full force, and summary in its execution of justice upon criminals like him. I should probably have handed the traitor over to his fate. But ere I had time to do so, he by chance held out to my cupidity a bribe so tempting that I forgot the deserving of my knavish guest in the eagerness with which I bartered his freedom as the price of its possession. He freely emptied his pockets at my bidding, and restored to me the gold, for the loss of which I never should have repined. As the base metal rolled at my feet, however, there glittered among the coins a jewel as truly mine as any of the rest, but which, as it met my sight, filled me with greater surprise and rapture than if it had been a new fallen star. It was a ring of peculiar design and workmanship, which had once been the property of my father, and after his death had been worn by my mother until the time of her marriage with Mr. Graham, when it was transferred to myself. I had ever prized it as a precious heirloom, and it was one of the few valuables which I took with me when I fled from my stepfather's house. The ring, with a watch and some other trinkets, had been left in the possession of Lucy when I parted with her at Rio, and the sight of it once more seemed to me like a voice from the grave. I eagerly sought to learn from my prisoner the source whence it had been obtained, but he maintained an obstinate silence. It was now my turn to plead, and at length the promise of instant permission to depart, unwhipped by justice, at the conclusion of his tale, wrung from him a secret fraught to me with vital interest. What I learned from him, in disjointed and often incoherent phrases, I will relate to you in few words. This man was Stephen Grant, the son of my old friend Ben. He had heard from his father's lips the story of your mother's misfortunes, and the circumstance of a violent quarrel which arose between Ben and his vixen wife, at the young stranger's introduction to their household, impressed the tale upon his recollection. From his account, it appeared that my long-continued absence from Lucy, during the time of my illness, was construed by her honest but distrustful counselor and friend into voluntary and cruel desertion. The poor girl, to whom my early life was all a mystery which she had never shared, and to whom much of my character and conduct was consequently inexplicable, began soon to feel convinced of the correctness of the old sailor's suspicions and fears. She had already applied to my employer for information concerning me, but he, who had heard of the pestilence to which I was exposed, and fully believed me to be among the dead, forbore to distress her by communication of his belief, and replied to her questionings with an obscurity which served to give new force to her hitherto vague and uncertain surmises. She positively refused, however, to leave our home, and clinging to the hope of my final return thither, remained where I had left her until the terrible fever began its ravages. Her small stock of money was by this time consumed. Her strength both of mind and body gave way, and Ben, becoming every day more confident that the simple-hearted Lucy had been betrayed and forsaken, persuaded her at last to sell her fortune, and with the sum thus raised flee the infected country before it should be too late. She sailed for Boston in the same vessel in which Ben shipped before the mast, and on reaching that port her humble protector took her immediately to the only home he had to offer. There your mother's sad fate found a mournful termination, and you, her infant child, were left to the mercy of the cruel woman, who, but for her consciousness of guilt and her fear of its betrayal, would doubtless have thrust you at once from the miserable shelter her dwelling afforded. This guilt consisted in a foul robbery committed by Nan and her already infamous son upon your innocent and hapless mother, now rendered, through her feebleness, an easy prey to their rapacity. The fruits of this vile theft, however, were never participated in by Nan, whose promising son so far exceeded her in duplicity and craft, that having obtained possession of the jewels for the alleged purpose of bartering them away, he reserved such as he thought proper, and appropriated to his own use the proceeds of the remainder. The antique ring which I now hold in my possession, the priceless relic of a mournful tragedy, would have shared the fate of the rest, but for its apparent worthlessness. To the luckless Stephen, however, it proved at last a temporary salvation from the felon's doom which must finally await that hardened sinner. And to me, to me, it remains to be proved whether the knowledge of the secrets to which it has been the key will bless my future life, or darken it with a heavier curse. Notwithstanding the information thus gained, and the exciting idea to which it gave rise, that my child might be still living and finally restored to me, I could not yet feel any security that these daring hopes were not destined to be crushed in their infancy, and that my newly found treasure might not again elude my eager search. To my inquiries concerning you, Gertrude, Stephen, who had no longer any motives for concealing the truth, declared his inability to acquaint me with any particulars of a later period than the time of your residence with Truman Flint. He knew that the Lamplighter had taken you to his home, and was accidentally made aware, a few months later, of your continuance in that place of refuge, from the old man's being, to use my informant's expression, such a confounded fool as to call upon his mother and voluntarily make compensation for injury done to her windows in your outburst of childish revenge. Further than this I could learn nothing, but it was enough to inspire all my energies, and fill me with one desire only, the recovery of my child. I hastened to Boston, had no difficulty in tracing your benefactor, and though he had been long since dead, found many a truthful witness to his well-known virtues. Nor, when I asked for his adopted child, did I find her forgotten in the quarter of the city where she had passed her childhood. More than one grateful voice was ready to respond to my questioning, and to proclaim the cause they had to remember the girl who, having experienced the trials of poverty, made it both the duty and the pleasure of her prosperity to administer to the wants of a neighborhood whose sufferings she had aforetime both witnessed and shared. But alas, to complete the sum of sad vicissitudes with which my unhappy destiny was already crowded, at the very moment when I was assured of my daughter's safety, and my ears were drinking in the sweet praises that accompanied the mention of her name, there fell upon me, like a thunderbolt, the startling words, "She is now the adopted child of sweet Emily Graham, the blind girl." Oh, strange coincidence! Oh, righteous retribution, which at the very moment when I was picturing to myself the consummation of my cherished hopes, crushed me once more beneath the iron hand of a destiny that would not be cheated of its victim. My child, my only child, bound by the gratitude and love of years to one in whose face I scarcely dared to look, lest my soul should be withered by the expression of condemnation which the consciousness of my presence would inspire. The seas and lands, which had hitherto divided us, seemed not to my tortured fancy so insurmountable a barrier between myself and my long-lost daughter, as the dreadful reflection that the only earthly being whose love I had hoped in time to win had been reared from her infancy in a household where my very name was a thing abhorred. Stung to the quick by the harrowing thought that all my prayers, entreaties, and explanations could never undo her early impressions, and that all my labors and all my love could never call forth other than a cold and formal recognition of my claims, or, worse still, a feigned and hypocritical pretense of filial affection, I half resolved to leave my child in ignorance of her birth, and never seek to look upon her face, rather than subject her to the terrible necessity of choosing between the friend whom she loved and the father from whose crimes she had learned to shrink with horror and dread. After wrestling and struggling long with contending and warring emotions, I resolved to make one endeavor to see and recognize you, Gertrude, and at the same time guard myself from discovery. I trusted, and as it proved, not without reason, to the immense change which time had wrought in my appearance, to conceal me effectually from all eyes but those which had known me intimately, and therefore approached Mr. Graham's house without the slightest fear of betrayal. I found it empty, and apparently deserted. I now directed my steps to the well-remembered counting-room, and here learned from a clerk, who was as it proved, but ill-informed concerning the movements of his master's family, that the whole household, including yourself, had been passing the winter in Paris and were at present at a German watering-place. Without hesitation or further inquiry, I took the steamer to Liverpool, and from thence hastened to Baden-Baden, a trifling excursion in the eyes of a traveller of my experience. Without risking myself in the presence of my stepfather, I took an early opportunity to obtain an introduction to Mrs. Graham, and thanks to her unreserved conversation, made myself master of the fact that Emily and yourself were left in Boston, and were at that time under the care of Dr. Jeremy. It was on my return voyage, which was immediately undertaken, that I made the acquaintance of Dr. Grisworth and his daughter, an acquaintance which accidentally proved of great value in facilitating my intercourse with yourself. Once more in Boston, Dr. Jeremy's house also wore a desolate appearance, and looked as if closed for the season. There was a man, however, making some repairs about the doorstep, who informed me that the family were absent from town. He was not himself aware of the direction they had taken, but the servants were at home, and could, no doubt, acquaint me with their route. Upon this, I boldly rung the doorbell. It was answered by Mrs. Ellis, the woman who, nearly 20 years before, had cruelly and unpityingly sounded in my ears the death knell of all my hopes in life. I saw at once that my incognito was secure, as she met my keen and piercing glance without quailing, shrinking, or taking flight, as I fully expected she would do at the sight of the ghost of my former self. She replied to my queries as coolly and collectedly as she had probably done during the day to some dozen of the doctor's disappointed patients, telling me that he had left that very morning for New York, and would not be back for 2 or 3 weeks. Nothing could have been more favorable to my wishes than the chance thus afforded of overtaking your party, and in the character of a traveling companion, introduced myself gradually to your notice. You know how this purpose was effected, how now in the rear and now in advance I nevertheless maintained a constant proximity to your footsteps. To add one particle to the comfort of yourself and Emily, to learn your plans, forestall your wishes, secure to your use the best of rooms, and bribe to your service the most devoted of attendants, I spared myself neither pains, fatigue, trouble, nor expense. For much of the freedom with which I approached you, and made myself an occasional member of your circle, I was indebted to Emily's blindness, for I could not doubt that otherwise time and its changes would fail to conceal from her my identity, and I should meet with a premature recognition. Nor, until the final act of the drama, when death stared us all in the face, and concealment became impossible, did I once trust my voice to her hearing. How closely, during those few weeks, I watched and weighed your every word and action, seeking even to read your thoughts in your face. None can tell whose acuteness is not sharpened and vivified by motives so all-engrossing as mine, and who can measure the anguish of the fond father, who day by day, learning to worship his child with a more absorbing idolatry, and yet not dared to clasp her to his heart. Especially when I saw you the victim of grief and trouble, did I long to assert a claim to your confidence, and more than once my self-control would have given way, but for the dread inspired by the gentle Emily, gentle to all but me. I could not brook the thought that with my confession I should cease to be the trusted friend, and become the abhorred parent. I preferred to maintain my distant and unacknowledged guardianship of my child, rather than that she should behold in me the dreaded tyrant who might tear her from the home from which he had himself been driven, and the hearts which, though warm with love for her, were ice and stone to him. And so I kept silent, and sometimes present to your sight, but still oftener hid from view. I hovered around your path, until that dreadful day, which you will long remember, when, everything forgotten but the safety of yourself and Emily, my heart spoke out, and betrayed my secret. And now you know all, my follies, misfortunes, sufferings, and sins. Can you love me, Gertrude? It is all I ask. I seek not to steal you from your present home, to rob poor Emily of a child whom she values perhaps as much as I. The only balm my wounded spirit seeks is the simple, guileless confession that you will at last try to love your father. I have no hope in this world, and none, alas, beyond, but in yourself. Could you feel my heart now beating against its prison bars, you would realize, as I do, that unless soothed it will burst ere long. Will you soothe it by your pity, my sweet, my darling child? Will you bless it by your love? If so, come clasp your arms around me, and whisper to me words of peace. Within sight of your window, in the old summer house at the end of the garden, with straining ear, I wait listening for your footsteps. End of chapter 47. Chapter 48 of The Lamplighter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bridget Gaige. The Lamplighter by Maria Susanna CUMMINS. Chapter 48. Around her path a vision's glow is cast. Back, back her loved one comes in hues of morn. For her the gulf is filled, the dark night fled, whose mystery parts the living and the dead. Hemans. As Gertrude's eyes, after greedily devouring the manuscript, fell upon its closing words, she sprung to her feet, and the next instant her little room, the floor strewed with the scattered sheets, which had dropped from her lap as she rose, is left vacant. She has flown down the staircase, escaped through the hall door, and bounding over a lawn at the back of the house, now wet with the evening dew, she approaches the summer house from the opposite entrance to that at which Mr. Amory, with folded arms and a fixed countenance, is watching for her coming. So noiseless is her light step, that before he is conscious of her presence, she has thrown herself upon his bosom, and her whole frame trembling with the vehemence of long suppressed, and now uncontrolled agitation, she bursts into a torrent of passionate tears, interrupted only by frequent sobs, so deep and so exhausting that her father, with his arms folded tightly around her, and clasping her so closely to his heart that she feels its irregular beating, endeavors to still the tempest of her grief, whispering softly as to an infant, "Hush, hush, my child, you frighten me." And gradually, soothed by his gentle caresses, her excitement subsides, and she is able to lift her face to his and smile upon him through her tears. They stand thus for many minutes, in a silence that speaks far more than words. Wrapped in the folds of his heavy cloak to preserve her from the evening air, and still encircled in his strong embrace, Gertrude feels that their union of spirit is not less complete, while the long-banished man, who for years has never felt the sweet influence of a kindly smile, glows with a melting tenderness which hardening solitude has not had the power to subdue. Again and again the moon retires behind a cloud, and peeps out to find them still in the attitude in which she saw them last. At length, as she gains a broad and open expanse, and looks clearly down, Mr. Amory, lifting his daughter's face, and gazing into her glistening eyes, while he gently strokes the disordered hair from her forehead, asks, in an accent of touching appeal, "You will love me, then?" "Oh, I do, I do!" exclaimed Gertrude, sealing his lips with kisses. His hitherto unmoved countenance relaxes at this fervent assurance. He bows his head upon her shoulder, and the strong man weeps. Not long, however. Her self-possession all restored at seeing him thus overcome, Gertrude places her hand in his, and startles him from his position by the firm and decided tone with which she whispers, "Come." "Whither?" exclaims he, looking up in surprise. "To Emily." With a half shudder and a mournful shake of the head he retreats, instead of advancing in the direction in which she would lead him. "I cannot." "But she waits for you. She, too, weeps and longs and prays for your coming." "Emily? You know not what you are saying, my child." "Indeed, indeed, my father, it is you who are deceived. Emily does not hate you. She never did. She believed you dead long ago, but your voice, though heard but once, has half robbed her of her reason. So wholly, so entirely does she love you still. Come, and she will tell you, better than I, what a wretched mistake has made martyrs of you both." Emily, who had heard the voice of Willie Sullivan as he bade Gertrude farewell on the doorstep, and rightly conjectured that it was he, forbore making any inquiries for the absent girl at the tea-table, and thinking it probable that she preferred to remain undisturbed, retired to the sitting-room at the conclusion of the meal, where, as Mr. Graham sought the library, she remained alone for more than an hour. It was a delightful, social-looking room. The fire still burned brightly, sending forth a ruddy glow, and, as the evening was unusually chilly for the season, rendering the temperature of the great old-fashioned parlor highly agreeable. There were candles under the mirror, but they did not give light enough to destroy the pleasant effect of the shadows which the firelight made upon the wall and about the couch where Emily was reclining. The invalid girl, if we may call her such, for in spite of ill health she still retained much of the freshness and all of the loveliness of her girlhood, had by chance chosen such a position, opposite to the cheerful blaze, that its flickering light played about her face, and brought to view the rich and unwonted bloom which inward excitement had called up in her usually pale countenance. The exquisite and refined taste which had always made Emily's dress an index to the soft purity of her character was never more strikingly developed than when she wore, as on the present occasion, a flowing robe of white cashmere, fastened at the waist with a silken girdle, and with full drapery sleeves, whose lining and border of snowy silk could only have been rivalled by the delicate hand and wrist which had escaped from beneath their folds, and somewhat nervously played with the heavy crimson fringe of a shawl, worn in the chilly dining-room, and now thrown carelessly over the arm of the sofa. Supporting herself upon her elbow, she sat with her head bent forward, and as she watched the images reflected in the glass of memory, one who knew her not, and was unaware of her want of sight, might have believed that, looking forth from her long drooping eyelashes, she were tracing imaginary forms among the shining embers, so intently was her face bent in that direction. Occasionally, as the summer wind sighed among the branches of the trees, causing them to beat lightly against the window-pane, she would lift her head from the hand on which it rested, and gracefully arching her slender throat, incline in a listening attitude, and then, as the trifling nature of the sound betrayed itself, she would sink, with a low sigh, into her former somewhat listless position. Once Mrs. Prime opened the door, looked around the room in search of the housekeeper, and not finding her, retreated across the passage, saying to herself as she did so, "Law, dear sakes alive, I wish she only had eyes now, to see how like a picture she looks." At length a low, quick bark from the house dog once more attracted her attention, and in a moment steps were heard crossing the piazza. Before they had gained the door, Emily was standing upright, straining her ear to catch the sound of every footfall, and when Gertrude and Mr. Amory entered, she looked more like a statue than a living figure, as with clasped hands, parted lips, and one foot slightly advanced, she silently awaited their approach. One glance at Emily's face, another at that of her agitated father, and Gertrude was gone. She saw the completeness of their mutual recognition, and with instinctive delicacy forbore to mar by her presence the sacredness of so holy an interview. As the door closed upon her retreating figure, Emily parted her clasped hands, stretched them forth into the dim vacancy, and murmured, "Philip!" He seized them between both of his, and with one step forward, fell upon his knees. As he did so, the half-fainting girl dropped upon the seat behind her. Mr. Amory bowed his head upon the hands, which, still held tightly between his own, now rested on her lap, and hiding his face upon her slender fingers, tremblingly uttered her name. "The grave has given up its dead!" exclaimed Emily. "My God, I thank thee!" And extracting her hands from his convulsive grasp, she flung her arms around his neck, rested her head upon his bosom, and whispered, in a voice half choked with emotion, "Philip, dear, dear Philip, am I dreaming, or have you come back again?" The conventional rules, the enforced restrictions, which often set limits to the outbursts of natural feeling, had no existence for one so wholly the child of nature as Emily. She and Philip had loved each other in their childhood. Before that childhood was fully past they had parted, and as children they met again. During the lapse of many years, in which, shut out from the world, she had lived among the cherished memories of the past, she had been safe from worldly contagion, and had retained all the guileless simplicity of girlhood, all the freshness of her springtime; and Philip, who had never willingly bound himself by any ties save those imposed upon him by circumstance and necessity, felt his boyhood come rushing upon him once more, as with Emily's soft hand resting on his head, she blessed heaven for his safe return. She could not see how time had silvered his hair, and sobered and shaded the face that she loved; whether he came in the shape of the fiery-eyed youth that she saw him last, the middle-aged man with hoary hair, whose years the curious found it hard to determine, or the glorified angel which she had pictured to herself in every dream of heaven, it was all alike to one whose world was a world of spirits. and to him, as he beheld the face he had half dreaded to encounter beaming with the holy light of sympathy and love, the blind girl's countenance seemed encircled with a halo not of earth, and therefore this union had in it less of earth than heaven. Had they wakened on the other side of the grave, and soul met soul in that happy land where the long parted meet, their rapture could scarcely have been more pure, their happiness more unalloyed. Not until, seated beside each other, with their hands still fondly clasped, Philip had heard from Emily's lips the history of her hopes, her fears, her prayers, and her despair, and she, while listening to the sad incidents of his life, had dropped upon the hand she held many a kiss and tear of sympathy, did either fully realize the mercy, so long delayed, so fully accorded now, which promised even on earth to crown their days. Emily wept at the tale of Lucy's trials and her early death, and when she learned that it was hers and Philip's child whom she had taken to her heart and fostered with the truest affection, she sent up a silent prayer of gratitude that it had been allotted to her apparently bereaved and darkened destiny to fulfill so blessed a mission. "If I could love her more, dear Philip," exclaimed she, while the tears trickled down her cheeks, "I would do so for your sake, and that of her sweet, innocent, suffering mother." "And you forgive me, then, Emily?" said Philip, as both having finished their sad recitals of the past, they gave themselves up to the sweet reflection of their present joy. "Forgive! Oh, Philip, what have I to forgive?" "The deed that locked you in prison darkness," he mournfully replied. "Philip!" exclaimed Emily, in a reproachful tone, "could you for one moment believe that I attributed that to you, that I blamed you for an instant even in my secret thought?" "Not willingly, I am sure, dear Emily. But oh, you have forgotten what I can never forget, that in your time of anguish, not only the obtruding thought, but the lip that gave utterance to it, proclaimed how your soul refused to pity and forgive the cruel hand that wrought you so much woe." "You cruel, Philip? Never, even in my wild frenzy, did I so abuse and wrong you. If my unfilial heart sinfully railed against the cruel injustice of my father, it was never guilty of such treachery towards you." "That fiendish woman lied, then, when she told me that you shuddered at my very name?" "If I shuddered, Philip, it was because my whole nature recoiled at the thought of the wrong that you had sustained. And oh, believe me, if she gave you any other assurance than of my continued love, it was because she labored under a sad and unhappy error." "Good heavens!" ejaculated Philip, "how wickedly have I been deceived!" "Not wickedly," replied Emily. "Mrs. Ellis, with all her stern formality, was in that instance the victim of circumstances. She was a stranger among us, and believed you other than you were. But had you seen her a few weeks later, sobbing over her share in the unhappy transaction which drove you to desperation, and, as we then supposed, to death, you would have felt, as I did, that we had greatly misjudged her in return, and that she carried a heart of flesh beneath a stony disguise. The bitterness of her grief astonished me at the time, for I never until now had reason to suspect that it was mingled with remorse at the recollection of her own harshness. Let us forget, however, the sad events of the past, and trust that the loving hand which has thus far shaped our course has but afflicted us in mercy." "In mercy!" exclaimed Philip. "What mercy does my past experience give evidence of, or your life of everlasting darkness? Can you believe it a loving hand which made me the ill-fated instrument, and you the lifelong sufferer, from one of the dreariest misfortunes that can afflict humanity?" "Speak not of my blindness as a misfortune," answered Emily. "I have long ceased to think it such. It is only through the darkness of the night that we discern the lights of heaven, and only when we shut out from earth that we enter the gates of paradise. With eyes to see the wonderful working of nature and nature's God, I nevertheless closed them to the evidences of almighty love that were around me on every side. While enjoying the beautiful and glorious gifts that were showered on my pathway, I forgot to thank and praise the giver, but with an ungrateful heart walked sinfully and selfishly on, little dreaming of the beguiling and deceitful snares which entangle the footsteps of youth. And therefore did He, who is ever over us for good, arrest with fatherly hand the child who was wandering from the only road that leads to peace. And though the discipline of His chastening rod was sudden and severe, mercy still tempered justice. From the tomb of my buried joys spring hopes that will bloom in immortality. From the clouds and the darkness broke forth a glorious light. What was hidden from my outer sight became manifest to my awakened soul, and even on earth my troubled spirit gained its eternal rest. Then grieve not, dear Philip, over the fate that, in reality, is far from sad, but rejoice with me in the thought of that blessed and not far distant awakening, when, with restored and beautified vision, I shall stand before God's throne, in full view of that glorious presence, from which, but for the guiding light which has burst upon my spirit through the veil of earthly darkness, I might have been eternally shut out." As Emily finished speaking, and Philip, gazing with awe upon the rapt expression of her soul-illumined face, beheld the triumph of an immortal mind, and pondered on the might, the majesty and power of the influence wrought by simple piety, the door of the room opened abruptly, and Mr. Graham entered. The sound of the well-known footstep disturbed the soaring thoughts of both, and the flush of excitement which had mounted into Emily's cheeks subsided into more than her wonted paleness, as Philip, rising slowly and deliberately from his seat at her side, stood face to face with her father. Mr. Graham approached with the puzzled and scrutinizing air of one who finds himself called upon in the character of a host to greet a visitor who, though an apparent stranger, may possibly have claims to recognition, and glanced at his daughter as if hoping she would relieve the awkwardness by an introduction. But the agitated Emily maintained perfect silence, and every feature of Philip's countenance remained immovable as Mr. Graham slowly came forward. He had advanced within one step of the spot where Philip stood waiting to receive him, when, struck by the stern look and attitude of the latter, he stopped short, gazed one moment into the eagle eyes of his stepson, then staggered, grasped at the mantelpiece, and would have fallen, but Philip, starting forward, helped him to his armchair, which stood opposite to the sofa. And yet no word was spoken. At length Mr. Graham, who having fallen into the seat, sat still gazing into the face of Mr. Amory, ejaculated in a tone of wondering excitement, "Philip Amory! Oh, my God!" "Yes, father," exclaimed Emily, suddenly rising and grasping her father's arm, "it is Philip, he whom we have so long believed among the dead, restored to us in health and safety." Mr. Graham rose from his chair, and leaning heavily on Emily's shoulder, again approached Mr. Amory, who, with folded arms, stood fixed as marble. His step tottered with a feebleness never before observable in the sturdy frame of the old man, and the hand which he extended to Philip was marked by an unusual tremulousness. But Philip did not offer to receive the proffered hand, or reply by word to the rejected salutation. Mr. Graham turned towards Emily, and forgetting that this neglect was shut from her sight, exclaimed, half bitterly, half sadly, "I cannot blame him. God knows I wronged the boy." "Wronged him?" cried Philip, in a voice so deep as to be almost fearful. "Yes, wronged him indeed, blighted his life, crushed his youth, half broke his heart, and wholly blasted his reputation." "No!" exclaimed Mr. Graham, who had quailed beneath these accusations, until he reached the final one. "Not that, Philip, not that! I never harmed you there. I discovered my error before I had doomed you to infamy in the eyes of one of your fellow men." "You acknowledge, then, the error?" I do. I imputed to you the deed which proved to have been accomplished through the agency of my most confidential clerk. I learned the truth almost immediately, but too late, alas, to recall you. Then came the news of your death, and I felt that the injury had been irreparable. But it was not strange, Philip, you must allow that. Archer had been in my employment more than 20 years. I had a right to believe him trustworthy." "No, oh no," replied Philip. "It was nothing strange that, a crime committed, you should have readily ascribed it to me. You thought me capable only of evil." "I was unjust, Philip," answered Mr. Graham, with an attempt to rally his dignity. "But I had some cause. "Perhaps so," responded Philip. "I am willing to grant that." "Let us shake hands upon it, then," said Mr. Graham, "and endeavor to forget the past." Philip did not again refuse to accede to this request, though there was but little warmth or eagerness in the manner of his compliance. Mr. Graham, seeming now to think the matter quite ended, looked relieved, and as if he had shaken off a burden which had been weighing upon his conscience for years. For he had a conscience, though not a very tender one, and subsiding into his armchair, begged to learn the particulars of Philip's experience during the last 20 years. The outline of the story was soon told, Mr. Graham listening to it with attention, and inquiring into its particulars with an interest which proved that, during a lengthened period of regret and remorse, his feelings had sensibly softened towards the stepson with every memory of whom there had come to his heart a pang of self-reproach. Mr. Amory was unable to afford any satisfactory explanation of the report of his own death, which had been confidently affirmed by Dr. Jeremy's correspondent at Rio. Upon a comparison of dates, however, it seemed probable that the doctor's agent had obtained this information from Philip's employer, who for some weeks previous to his own death had every reason to believe that the young man had perished of the infection prevailing in the low and unhealthy region to which he had been dispatched. To Philip himself it was an almost equal matter of wonder that his friends should ever have obtained knowledge of his flight and destination. But this was more easily accounted for, since the vessel in which he had embarked returned directly to Boston, and there were among her crew and officers those who had ample means of replying to the inquiries which the benevolent doctor had set on foot some months before, and which, being accompanied by the offer of a liberal reward, had not yet ceased to attract the attention of the public. Notwithstanding the many strange and romantic incidents which were unfolding themselves, none seemed to produce so great an impression upon Mr. Graham's mind as the singular circumstance that the child who had been reared under his roof, and endeared herself to him in spite of some clashing of interests and opinions, should prove to be Philip's daughter. As he left the room, at the conclusion of the tale, and again sought the solitude of his library, he muttered to himself more than once, "Singular coincidence! Very singular, very!" Hardly had he departed, before another door was timidly opened, and Gertrude looked cautiously in. Her father went quickly towards her, and passing his arm around her waist, drew her towards Emily, and clasped them both in a long and silent embrace. "Philip," exclaimed Emily, "can you still doubt the mercy and love which have spared us for such a meeting?" "Oh, Emily," replied he, "I am deeply grateful. Teach me how and where to bestow my tribute of praise." On the hour of sweet communion which succeeded we forbear to dwell, the silent rapture of Emily, the passionately expressed joy of Philip, or the trusting, loving glances which Gertrude cast upon both. It was nearly midnight when Mr. Amory rose, and announced his intention to depart. Emily, who had not thought of his leaving the spot which she hoped he would now consider his home, entreated him to remain, and Gertrude with her eyes joined in the eager petition. But he persisted in his resolution with a firmness and seriousness which proved how vain would be the attempt to shake it. "Philip," said Emily, at length, laying her hand upon his arm, "you have not yet forgiven my father." She had divined his thoughts. He shrank under her reproachful tones, and made no answer. "But you will, dear Philip, you will?" continued she, in a pleading voice. He hesitated, then glanced at her once more, and replied, "I will, dearest Emily, I will, in time." When he had gone, Gertrude lingered a moment at the door to watch his retreating figure, just visible in the light of the waning moon, then returned to the parlor, drawing a long breath and saying, "Oh, what a day this has been!" but checked herself at the sight of Emily, who, kneeling by the sofa with clasped hands, uplifted face, and with her white garments sweeping the floor, looked the very impersonation of purity and prayer. Throwing one arm around her neck, Gertrude knelt on the floor beside her, and together they sent up to the throne of God the incense of thanksgiving and praise. End of chapter 48. Chapter 49 of The Lamplighter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bridget Gaige. The Lamplighter by Maria Susanna CUMMINS. Chapter 49. Thee I have loved, thou gentlest, from a child, and borne thine image with me o'er the sea. Thy soft voice in my soul, speak! Oh, yet live for me! Hemans. When Uncle True died, Mr. Cooper reverently buried his old friend in the ancient graveyard which adjoined the church where he had long officiated as sexton. It was a dilapidated-looking place, whose half-fallen and moss-grown stones proclaimed its recent neglect and disuse. But long before the adjacent and time-worn building gave place to a more modern and more imposing structure, the hallowed remains of Uncle True had found a quieter resting place. With that good taste and good feeling which, in latter days, has dedicated to the sacred dead some of the fairest spots on earth, A beautiful piece of undulating woodland in the neighborhood of Mr. Graham's country residence had been consecrated as a rural cemetery, and in the loveliest nook of this sweet and venerated spot the ashes of the good old lamplighter found their final repose. This lot of land, which had been purchased through Willie's thoughtful liberality, selected by Gertrude, and by her made fragrant and beautiful with summer rose and winter ivy, now enclosed also the forms of Mr. Cooper and Mrs. Sullivan, and over these 3 graves Gertrude had planted many a flower, and watered it with her tears. Especially did she view it as a sacred duty and privilege to mark the anniversary of the death of each by a tribute of fresh garlands, and with this pious purpose in view, she left Mr. Graham's house one beautiful afternoon, about a week after the events took place which are narrated in the previous chapter. She carried on her arm a basket, which contained her offering of flowers, and as she had a long walk before her, started at a rapid pace. Let us follow her, and briefly pursue the train of thought which accompanied her on her way. She had left her father with Emily. She would not ask him to join her in her walk, though he had once expressed a desire to visit the grave of Uncle True, for he and Emily were talking together so contentedly it would have been a pity to disturb them, and for a few moments Gertrude's reflections were engrossed by the thought of their calm and tranquil happiness. She thought of herself, too, as associated with them both, of the deep and long-tried love of Emily, and of the fond outpourings of affection daily and hourly lavished upon her by her newly found parent, and felt that she could scarcely repay their kindness by the devotion of a lifetime. Now and then, as she dwelt in her musings upon the sweet tie between herself and Emily, which had gained strength with every succeeding year, and the equally close and kindred union between father and child, which though recent in its origin was scarcely capable of being more firmly cemented by time, her thoughts would, in spite of herself, wander to that earlier formed and not less tender friendship, now, alas, sadly ruptured and wounded, if not wholly uprooted and destroyed. She tried to banish the remembrance of Willie's faithlessness and desertion, deeming it the part of an ungrateful spirit to mourn over past hopes, regardless of the blessings that yet remained. She tried to keep in mind the resolutions lately formed to forget the most painful feature in her past life, and consecrate the remainder of her days to the happiness of her father and Emily. But it would not do. The obtruding and painful recollection presented itself continually, notwithstanding her utmost efforts to repress it, and at last, ceasing the struggle, she gave herself up for the time to a deep and saddening reverie. She had received 2 visits from Willie since the one already mentioned, but the second meeting had been in its character very similar to the first, and on the succeeding occasion the constraint had increased instead of diminishing. Several times Willie had made an apparent effort to break through this unnatural barrier, and speak and act with the freedom of former days, but a sudden blush or sign of confusion and distress on Gertrude's part deterred him from any further attempt to put to flight the reserve and want of confidence which subsisted in their intercourse. Again Gertrude, who had resolved, previous to his last visit, to meet him with the frankness and cordiality which he might reasonably expect, smiled upon him affectionately at his coming, and offered her hand with such sisterly freedom that he was emboldened to take and retain it in his grasp, and was evidently on the point of unburdening his mind of some weighty secret, when she turned abruptly away, took up some trivial piece of work, and while she seemed wholly absorbed in it, addressed to him an unimportant question, a course of conduct which put to flight all his ideas, and disconcerted him for the remainder of his stay. As Gertrude pondered the awkward and distressing results of every visit he had made her, she half hoped he would discontinue them altogether, believing that the feelings of both would be less wounded by total separation than by interviews which must leave on the mind of each a still greater sense of estrangement. Strange as it may seem, she had not yet acquainted him with the event so deep in its interest to herself, the discovery of her dearly loved father. Once she tried to speak of it, but found herself so overcome at the very idea of imparting to the confidant of her childhood an experience of which she could scarcely yet think without emotion, that she paused in the attempt, fearing that, should she, on any topic, give way to her sensibilities, she should lose all restraint over her feelings, and lay open her whole heart to Willie. But there was one thing that distressed her more than all others. In his first vain attempt to throw off all disguise, Willie had more than intimated to her his own unhappiness, and ere she could find an opportunity to change the subject, and repel a confidence for which she still felt herself unprepared, he had gone so far as to speak mournfully of his future prospects in life. The only construction which Gertrude could give to this confession was that it had reference to his engagement with Isabel, and it gave rise at once to the suspicion that, infatuated by her beauty, he had impulsively and heedlessly bound himself to one who could never make him wholly happy. The little scenes to which she had herself been a witness corroborated this idea, as, on both occasions of her seeing the lovers and overhearing their words, some cause of vexation seemed to exist on Willie's part. He loves her, thought Gertrude, and is also bound to her in honor, but he sees already the want of harmony in their natures. Poor Willie! It is impossible he should ever be happy with Isabel. And Gertrude's sympathizing heart mourned not more deeply over her own grief than over the disappointment that Willie must be experiencing, if he had ever hoped to find peace in a union with so overbearing, ill-humored, and unreasonable a girl. Wholly occupied with these and similar musings, she walked on with a pace of whose quickness she was scarcely herself aware, and soon gained the shelter of the heavy pines which bordered the entrance to the cemetery. Here she paused for a moment to enjoy the refreshing breeze that played beneath the branches, and then, passing through the gateway, entered a carriage road at the right, and proceeded slowly up the gradual ascent. The place, always quiet and peaceful, seemed unusually still and secluded, and save the occasional carol of a bird, there was no sound to disturb the perfect silence and repose. As Gertrude gazed upon the familiar beauties of those sacred grounds, which had been her frequent resort during several years, as she walked between beds of flowers, inhaled the fragrant and balmy air, and felt the solemn appeal, the spiritual breathings, that haunted the holy place, every emotion that was not in harmony with the scene gradually took its flight, and she experienced only that sensation of sweet and half-joyful melancholy which was awakened by the thought of the happy dead. After a while she left the broad road which she had been following, and turned into a little by-path. This she pursued for some distance, and then, again diverging through another and still narrower foot-track, gained the shady and retired spot which, partly from its remoteness to the public walks, and partly from its own natural beauty, had attracted her attention and recommended itself to her choice. It was situated on the slope of a little hill. A huge rock protected it on one side from the observation of the passer-by, and a fine old oak overshadowed it upon the other. The iron enclosure, of simple workmanship, was nearly overgrown by the green ivy, which had been planted there by Gertrude's hand, and the moss-grown rock also was festooned by its graceful and clinging tendrils. Upon a jutting piece of stone, directly beside the grave of Uncle True, Gertrude seated herself, as was her wont, and after a few moments of contemplation, during which she sat with her elbow upon her knee and her head resting upon her hand, she straightened her slight figure, sighed heavily, and then, lifting the cover of her basket, emptied her flowers upon the grass, and with skilful fingers commenced weaving a graceful chaplet, which, when completed, she placed upon the grave at her feet. With the remainder of the blossoms she strewed the other mounds, and then, drawing forth a pair of gardening gloves and a little trowel, she employed herself for nearly an hour among the flowers and vines with which she had embowered the spot. Her work at last being finished, she again placed herself at the foot of the old rock, removed her gloves, pushed back from her forehead the simple but heavy braids of her hair, and appeared to be resting from her labors. It was 7 years that day since Uncle True died, but the time had not yet come for Gertrude to forget the simple, kind old man. Often did his pleasant smile and cheering words come to her in her dreams, and both by day and night did the image of him who had gladdened and blessed her childhood encourage her to the imitation of his humble and patient virtue. As she gazed upon the grassy mound that covered him, and scene after scene rose up before her in which that earliest friend in herself had whiled away the happy hours, there came, to embitter the otherwise cherished remembrance, the recollection of that third and seldom absent one, who completed and made perfect the memory of their fireside joys, and Gertrude, while yielding to the inward reflection, unconsciously exclaimed aloud, "Oh, Uncle True, you and I are not parted yet, but Willie is not of us." "Oh, Gertrude," said a reproachful voice close at her side, "is Willie to blame for that?" She started, turned, saw the object of her thoughts, with his mild, sad eyes fixed inquiringly upon her, and without replying to his question, buried her face in her hands. He threw himself upon the ground at her feet, and as on the occasion of their first childish interview, gently lifted her bowed head from the hands upon which it had fallen, and compelled her to look him in the face, saying, at the same time, in the most imploring accents, "Tell me, Gertie, in pity, tell me why I am excluded from your sympathy." But still she made no reply, except by the tears that coursed down her cheeks. "You make me miserable," continued he, vehemently. "What have I done that you have so shut me out of your affection? Why do you look so coldly upon me, and even shrink from my sight?" added he, as Gertrude, unable to endure his steadfast, searching look, turned her eyes in another direction, and strove to free her hands from his grasp. "I am not cold, I do not mean to be," said she, her voice half choked with emotion. "Oh, Gertrude," replied he, relinquishing her hands and turning away, "I see you have wholly ceased to love me. I trembled when I first beheld you, so lovely, so beautiful, and so beloved by all, and feared lest some fortunate rival had stolen your heart from its boyish keeper. But even then I did not dream that you would refuse me, at least, a brother's claim to your affection." "I will not!" exclaimed Gertrude eagerly. "Oh, Willie, you must not be angry with me. Let me be your sister." He smiled a most mournful smile. "I was right, then," continued he. "You feared lest I should claim too much, and discouraged my presumption by awarding me nothing. Be it so; perhaps your prudence was for the best. But oh, Gertrude, it has made me heartbroken." "Willie!" exclaimed Gertrude with excitement, "do you know how strangely you are speaking?" "Strangely?" responded Willie, in a half offended tone. "Is it so strange that I should love you? Have I not for years cherished the remembrance of our past affection, and looked forward to our reunion as my only hope of happiness? Has not this fond expectation inspired my labors, and cheered my toils, and endeared to me my life, in spite of its bereavements? And can you, in the very sight of these cold mounds, beneath which lie buried all else that I held dear on earth, crush and destroy, without compassion, this solitary but all engrossing—" "Willie," interrupted Gertrude, her calmness suddenly restored, and speaking in a kind but serious tone, "is it honorable for you to address me thus? Have you forgotten—" "No, I have not forgotten," exclaimed he, vehemently. "I have not forgotten that I have no right to distress or annoy you, and I will do so no more. But oh, Gertie, my sister Gertie, since all hope of a nearer tie is at an end, blame me not and wonder not if I fail at present to perform a brother's part. I cannot stay in this neighborhood. I cannot be the patient witness of another's happiness. My services, my time, my life you may command, and in my far distant home I will never cease to pray that the husband you have chosen, whoever he may be, may prove himself worthy of my noble Gertrude, and love her one half as well as I do." "Willie," said Gertrude, "what madness is this? I am bound by no such tie as you describe, but what shall I think of your treachery to Isabel?" "To Isabel!" cried Willie, starting up, as if seized with a new idea. "And has that silly rumor reached you too? And did you put faith in the falsehood?" "Falsehood!" exclaimed Gertrude, lifting her hitherto drooping eyelids, and casting upon him, through their wet lashes, a look of earnest scrutiny. Calmly returning a glance which he had neither avoided nor quailed under, Willie responded, unhesitatingly, and with a tone of astonishment not unmingled with reproach. "Falsehood, yes. With the knowledge you have both of her and myself, could you doubt its being such for a moment?" "Oh, Willie," cried Gertrude, "could I doubt the evidence of my own eyes and ears? Had I trusted to less faithful witnesses, I might have been deceived. Do not attempt to conceal from me the truth to which my own observation can testify. Treat me with frankness, Willie. Indeed, indeed, I deserve it at your hands." "Frankness, Gertrude? It is you only who are mysterious. Could I lay my whole soul bare to your gaze, you would be convinced of its truth, its perfect truth, to its first affection. And as to Isabel Clinton, if it is to her that you have reference, your eyes and your ears have both played you false, if—" "Oh, Willie, Willie!" exclaimed Gertrude, interrupting him. "Have you so soon forgotten your devotion to the belle of Saratoga, your unwillingness to sanction her temporary absence from your sight? the pain which the mere suggestion of the journey caused you, and the fond impatience which threatened to render those few days an eternity?" "Stop, stop!" cried Willie, a new light breaking in upon him. "And tell me where you learned all this." "In the very spot where you spoke and acted. Mr. Graham's parlor did not witness our first meeting. In the public promenade ground, on the shore of Saratoga Lake, and on board the steamboat at Albany, did I both see and recognize you, myself unknown. There, too, did your own words serve to convince me of the truth of that which from other lips I had refused to believe. The sunshine which gilds the morning is scarcely more bright and gladsome than the glow of rekindled hope which now animated the face of Willie. Listen to me, Gertrude," said he, in a fervent and almost solemn tone, "and believe that in sight of my mother's grave, and in the presence of that pure spirit," and he looked reverently upward, "who taught me the love of truth, I speak with such sincerity and candor as are fitting for the ears of angels. I do not question the accuracy with which you overheard my expostulations and entreaties on the subject of Miss Clinton's proposed journey, or the impatience I expressed at parting for her speedy return. I will not pause, either, to inquire where the object of all my thoughts could have been at the time, that notwithstanding the changes of years, she escaped my eager eyes. Let me first clear myself of the imputation under which I labor, and then there will be room for all further explanations. I did, indeed, feel deep pain at Miss Clinton's sudden departure for New York, under pretext which ought not to have weighed with her for a moment. I did indeed employ every argument to dissuade her from her purpose, and when my eloquence had failed to induce the abandonment of the scheme, I availed myself of every suggestion and motive which might possibly influence her to shorten her absence, not because the society of the selfish girl was essential, or even conducive to my own happiness, far from it, but because her excellent father, who so worshipped and idolized his only child that he would have thought no sacrifice too great by means of which he could add one particle to her enjoyment, was at that very time, amid all the noise and discomfort of a crowded watering-place, hovering between life and death, and I was disgusted at the heartlessness which voluntarily left the fondest of parents deprived of all female tending, to the charge of a hired nurse, and an unskilled though willing youth like myself. That eternity might, in Miss Clinton's absence, set a seal to the life of her father, was a thought which, in my indignation, I was on the point of uttering. But I checked myself, unwilling to interfere too far in a matter which came not within my rightful province, and perhaps excite unnecessary alarm in Isabel. If selfishness mingled at all in my views, dear Gertie, and made me over impatient for the return of the daughter to her post of duty, it was that I might be released from almost constant attendance upon my invalid friend, and hasten to her from whom I hoped such warmth of greeting as I was only too eager to bestow. Can you wonder, then, that your reception struck cold upon my throbbing heart?" "But you understand the cause of that coldness now," said Gertrude, looking up at him through a rain of tears, which like a summer sun-shower reflected itself in rainbow smiles upon her happy countenance. "You know now why I dared not let my heart speak out." "And this was all, then?" cried Willie. "And you are free, and I may love you still?" "Free from all bonds, dear Willie, but those which you yourself clasped around me, and which have encircled me from my childhood." And now, with heart pressed to heart, they pour in each other's ear the tale of a mutual affection, planted in infancy, nourished in youth, fostered and strengthened amid separation and absence, and perfected through trial, to bless and sanctify every year of their after life. "But Gertie," exclaimed Willie, as confidence restored they sat side by side, conversing freely of the past, "how could you think, for an instant, that Isabel Clinton would have power to displace you in my regard? I was not guilty of so great an injustice towards you, for even when I believed myself supplanted by another, I fancied that other some hero of such shining qualities as could scarcely be surpassed." "And who could surpass Isabel?" inquired Gertie. "Can you wonder that I trembled for your allegiance, when I thought of her beauty, her fashion, her family, and her wealth, and remembered the forcible manner in which all these were presented to your sight and knowledge? But what are all these, Gertie, to one who knows her as we do? Do not a proud eye and a scornful lip destroy the effect of beauty? Can fashion excuse rudeness, or noble birth cover natural deficiencies? And as to money, what did I ever want of that, except to employ it for the happiness of yourself and them?" And he glanced at the graves of his mother and grandfather. Oh, Willie, you are so disinterested." Not in this case. Had Isabel possessed the beauty of a Venus and the wisdom of a Minerva, I could not have forgotten how little happiness there could be with one who, while devoting herself to the pursuit of pleasure, had become dead to natural affections, and indifferent to the holiest of duties. Could I see her flee from the bedside of her father to engage in the frivolities and drink in the flatteries of an idle crowd? Or when unwillingly summoned thither, shrink from the toils and the watchings imposed by his feebleness, and still imagining that such a woman could bless and adorn a fireside? Could I fail to contrast her unfeeling neglect, ill-concealed petulance, flagrant levity and irreverence of spirit, with the sweet and loving devotion, the saintly patience, and the deep and fervent piety of my own Gertrude? I should have been false to myself as well as to you, dearest, if such traits of character as Miss Clinton constantly evinced could have weakened my love and admiration for yourself. And now, to see the little playmate whose image I cherished so fondly matured into the lovely and graceful woman, her sweet attractions crowned by so much beauty as almost to place her beyond recognition, and still her heart as much my own as ever. Oh, Gertie, it is too much happiness. Would that I could impart a share of it to those who loved us both so well." And who can say that they did not share it, that the spirit of Uncle True was not there to witness the completion of his many hopeful prophecies, that the old grandfather was not there to see all his doubts and fears giving place to joyful certainties, and that the soul of the gentle mother, whose rapt slumbers had, even in life, foreshadowed such a meeting, and who, by the lessons she had given to her child in his boyhood, the warnings spoken to his later years, and the ministering guidance of her disembodied spirit, had fitted him for the struggle with temptation, sustained him through its trials, and restored him triumphant to the sweet friend of his infancy. Who shall say that, even now, she hovered not over them with parted wings, realizing the joy prefigured in that dreamy vision which pictured to her sight the union between the son and daughter of her love, when the one, shielded by her fond care from every danger, and snatched from the power of temptation, should be restored to the arms of the other, who, by long and patient continuance in well-doing, had earned so full a recompense, so all-sufficient a reward. End of chapter 49. Chapter 50 of The Lamplighter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bridget Gaige. The Lamplighter by Maria Susanna CUMMINS. Chapter 50. Through night to light, in every stage, from childhood's morn to hoary age, what shall illume the pilgrimage by mortals trod? There is a pure and heavenly ray, that brightest shines in darkest day. When earthly beams are quenched for aye, 'tis lit by God. The sun was casting long shadows, and the sunset hour was near, when Gertrude and Willie rose to depart. They left the cemetery by a different gateway, and in the opposite direction to that by which Gertrude had entered. Here Willie found the chaise in which he had come, though the horse had contrived to loosen the bridle by which he was fastened, had strayed to the side of the road, eaten as much grass as he wished, or the place afforded, and was now sniffing the air, looking up and down the road, and despairing of his master's return, seemed on the point of taking his departure. He was reclaimed, however, without difficulty, and as if glad after his long rest to be again in motion, brought them in half an hour to Mr. Graham's door. As soon as they came in sight of the house, Gertrude, familiar with the customary ways of the family, perceived that something unusual was going forward. Lamps were moving about in every direction. The front door stood wide open. There was, what she had never seen before, the blaze of a bright fire discernible through the windows of the best chamber, and as they drew still nearer, she observed that the piazza was half covered with trunks. All these appearances, as she rightly conjectured, betokened the arrival of Mrs. Graham, and possibly of other company. She might, perhaps, have regretted the ill-timed coming of this bustling lady, at the very moment when she was eager for a quiet opportunity to present Willie to Emily and her father, and communicate to them her own happiness. But if such a thought presented itself, it vanished in a moment. Her joy was too complete to be marred by so trifling a disappointment. "Let us drive up the avenue, Willie," said she, "to the side door, so that George may see us, and take your horse to the stable." "No," said Willie, as he stopped opposite the front gate. "I can't come in now. There seems to be a house full of company. and besides, I have an appointment in town at 8 o'clock, and promised to be punctual." He glanced at his watch as he spoke, and added, "It is near that already. I did not think of its being so late. But I shall see you to-morrow morning, may I not?" She looked her assent, and with a warm grasp of the hand as he helped her from the chaise, and a mutual smile of confidence and love, they separated. He drove rapidly towards Boston, and she, opening the gate, found herself in the arms of Fanny Bruce, who had been impatiently awaiting the departure of Willie to seize her dear Miss Gertrude, and between tears and kisses pour out her congratulations and thanks for her happy escape from that horrid steamboat, for this was the first time they had met since the accident. "Has Mrs. Graham come, Fanny?" asked Gertrude as, the first excitement of the meeting over, they walked up to the house together. Yes, indeed, Mrs. Graham and Kitty and Isabel and a little girl and a sick gentleman, Mr. Clinton, I believe, and another gentleman, but he's gone. Who has gone? Oh, a tall, dignified-looking man, with black eyes and a beautiful face and hair as white as if he were old, and he isn't old either. And you say he has gone? Yes, he didn't come with the rest. He was here when I came, and he went away about an hour ago. I heard him tell Miss Emily that he had agreed to meet a friend in Boston, but perhaps he'll come back this evening. I hope he will, Miss Gertrude. You ought to see him." They had now reached the house, and through the open door Gertrude could plainly distinguish the lone tones of Mrs. Graham's voice proceeding from the parlour on the right. She was talking to her husband and Emily, and was just saying, as Gertrude entered, "Oh, it was the most awful thing I ever heard of in my life, and to think, Emily, of your being on board, and our Isabel. Poor child, she hasn't got her colour back yet, after her fright. And Gertrude Flint, too. By the way, they say Gertrude behaved very well. Where is the child?" Turning round, she now saw Gertrude, who was just entering the room, and going towards her she kissed her with considerable heartiness and sincerity. For Mrs. Graham, though somewhat coarse and blunt, was not without good feelings when the occasion was such to awaken them. Gertrude's entrance having served to interrupt the stream of exclamatory remarks in which the excitable lady had been indulging for 10 minutes or more, she now bethought herself of the necessity of removing her bonnet and outside garments, a part of which, being loosed from their fastenings, she had been dragging after her about the floor. "Well," exclaimed she, "I suppose I had better follow the girl's example, and go and get some of the dust off from me. I'm half buried, I believe. But there, that's better than coming in on the horrid steamboat, last night, as my brother Clinton was so crazy as to propose. Where's Bridget? I want her to take up some of my things." "I will assist you," said Gertrude, taking up a little carpet bag, throwing a scarf which had been stretching across the room over her arm, and then following Mrs. Graham closely in order to support the heavy travelling shawl which was hanging half off that lady's shoulders. At the first landing place, however, she found herself suddenly encircled in Kitty's warm embrace, and laying down her burdens, gave herself up for a few moments to the hugging and kissing that succeeded. At the head of the staircase she met Isabel, wrapped in a dressing gown, with a large pitcher in her hand, and a most discontented and dissatisfied expression of countenance. She set the pitcher on the floor, however, and saluted Gertrude with a good grace. "I'm glad to see you alive," said she, "though I can't look at you without shuddering. It reminds me so of that dreadful day when we were in such frightful danger. How lucky we were to be saved, when there were so many drowned. I've wondered ever since, Gertrude, how you could be so calm. I'm sure I shouldn't have known what to do if you hadn't been there to suggest. But oh dear, don't let us speak of it. It's a thing I can't bear to think of." And with a shudder and a shrug of the shoulders, Isabel dismissed the subject, and called somewhat pettishly to Kitty. "Kitty, I thought you went to get our pitcher filled." Kitty, who in obedience to a loud call and demand from her aunt, had hastily run to her room with the little travelling bag which Gertrude had dropped on the staircase, now came back quite out of breath, saying, "I did ring the bell twice. Hasn't anybody come?" "No," replied Belle, "and I should like to wash my face and curl my hair before tea, if I could." "Let me take the pitcher," said Gertrude. "I am going downstairs, and will send Jane up with the water." "Thank you," said Belle, rather feebly, while Kitty exclaimed, "No, no, Gertrude, I'll go myself." But it was too late. Gertrude had gone. Gertrude found Mrs. Ellis full of troubles and perplexities. "Only think," said the astonished housekeeper, "of their coming, 5 of them, without the least warning in the world, and here I've nothing in the house fit for tea, not a bit of rich cake, not a scrap of cold ham. And of course they're hungry after their long journey, and will want something nice." "Oh, if they are very hungry, Mrs. Ellis, they can eat dried beef and fresh biscuit and plain cake, and if you will give me the keys, I will get out the preserves and the best silver, and see that the table is set properly." Nothing was a trouble to Gertrude that night. Everything that she touched went right. Jane caught her spirit and became astonishingly active, and when the really bountiful table was spread, and Mrs. Ellis, after glancing around, and seeing that all was as it should be, looked into the beaming eyes and observed the glowing cheek and sunny smile of the happy girl, she exclaimed in her ignorance, "Good gracious, Gertrude, anybody would think you were overjoyed to see all these folks back again." It wanted but a few moments to tea time, and Gertrude was selecting fresh napkins from a drawer in the china closet, when Kitty Ray peeped in at the door, and finally entered, leading by the hand a little girl, neatly dressed in black. Her face was, at first, full of smiles, but the moment she attempted to speak, she burst into tears, and throwing her arms round Gertrude's neck, whispered in her ear, "Oh, Gertrude, I'm so happy, I came to tell you." "Happy?" replied Gertrude. "Then you mustn't cry." Upon this Kitty laughed, and then cried again, and then laughed once more, and in the intervals explained to Gertrude that she was engaged, had been engaged a week, to the best man in the world, and that the child she held by the hand was his orphan niece, and just like a daughter to him. "And only think," continued she, "it's all owing to you." "To me?" said the astonished Gertrude. "Yes, because I was so vain and silly, you know, and liked folks that were not worth liking, and didn't care much for anybody's comfort but my own. And if you hadn't taught me to be something better than that, and set me a good example, which I've tried to follow ever since, he never would have thought of looking at me, much less loving me, and believing I should be a fit mother for little Gracie here." And she looked down affectionately at the child, who was clinging fondly to her. "He is a minister, Gertrude, and very good. Only think of such a childish creature as I am being a minister's wife." The sympathy which Kitty came to claim was not denied her, and Gertrude, with her own eyes brimming with tears, assured her of her full participation in her joy. In the meantime, little Grace, who still clung to Kitty with one hand, had gently inserted the other within that of Gertrude, who, looking down upon her for the first time, recognized the child whom she had rescued from persecution in the drawing room at Saratoga. Kitty was charmed with the coincidence, and Gertrude, as she remarked the happy transformation which had already been effected in the countenance and dress of the little girl, who had been so sadly in want of female superintendence, felt an added conviction of the wisdom of the young clergyman's choice. Kitty was eager to give Gertrude a description of her lover, but a summons to the tea-table compelled her to postpone all further communications. Mr. Graham's cheerful parlour had never looked so cheerful as on that evening. The weather was mild, but a light fire, which had been kindled on Mr. Clinton's account, did not render the room too warm. It had, however, driven the young people into a remote corner, leaving the neighbourhood of the fireplace to Mrs. Graham and Emily, who occupied the sofa, and Mr. Clinton and Mr. Graham, whose armchairs were placed on the opposite side. This arrangement enabled Mr. Graham to converse freely and uninterruptedly with his guest upon some grave topic of interest, while his talkative wife entertained herself and Emily by a recapitulation of her travels and adventures. On a table, at the further extremity of the room, was placed a huge portfolio of beautiful engravings, recently purchased and brought home by Mr. Graham, and representing a series of European views. Gertrude and Kitty were turning them carefully over, and little Grace, who was sitting in Kitty's lap, and Fanny, who was leaning over Gertrude's shoulder, were listening eagerly to the young lady's explanations and comments. Occasionally Isabel, the only restless or unoccupied person present, would lean over the table to glance at the likeness of some familiar spot, and exclaim, "Kitty, there's the shop where I bought my blue silk!" Or, "Kitty, there's the waterfall that we visited in company with the Russian officers." While the assembled company were thus occupied, the door opened, and without any announcement, Mr. Amory and William Sullivan entered. Had either made his appearance singly, he would have been looked upon with astonishment by the majority of the company; but coming as they did, together, and with an apparently good understanding existing between them, there was no countenance present, save the children's, which expressed any emotion but that of utter surprise. Mr. and Mrs. Graham, however, were too much accustomed to society to betray any further evidence of that sentiment than was contained in a momentary glance, and rising, received their visitors with due politeness and propriety. The former nodded carelessly to Mr. Amory, whom he had seen in the morning, presented him to Mr. Clinton, without, however, mentioning the existing connection with himself, and was preparing to go through the same ceremony to Mrs. Graham, but was saved the trouble, as she had not forgotten the acquaintance formed at Baden-Baden. Willie's knowledge of the company also spared the necessity of introduction to all but Emily, and that being accidentally omitted, he gave an arch glance at Gertrude, and taking an offered seat near Isabel, entered into conversation with her, Mr. Amory being in like manner engrossed by Mrs. Graham. "Miss Gertrude," whispered Fanny, as soon as the interrupted composure of the party was once more restored, and glancing at Willie as she spoke, "that's the gentleman you were out driving with this afternoon. I know it is," continued she, as she observed Gertrude change colour, and endeavour to hush her, while she looked anxiously round, as if fearful the remark had been overheard. "Is it Willie, Gertrude? Is it Mr. Sullivan?" Gertrude became more and more embarrassed, while the mischievous Fanny continued to ply her with questions, and Isabel, who had jealously noticed that Willie's eyes wandered more than once to the table, turned on her such a scrutinizing look as rendered her confusion distressing. Accident came to her relief, however. The housemaid, with the evening paper, endeavored to open the door, against which her chair was placed, thus giving her an opportunity to rise, receive the paper, and, at the same time, an unimportant message. While she was thus engaged, Mr. Clinton left his chair, with the feeble step of an invalid, crossed the room, addressed a question in a low voice to Willie, and receiving an affirmatory reply, took Isabel by the hand, and approaching Mr. Amory, exclaimed with deep emotion, "Sir, Mr. Sullivan tells me that you are the person who saved the life of my daughter, and here she is to thank you." Mr. Amory rose, and flung his arm over the shoulder and around the waist of Gertrude, who was passing on her way to hand the newspaper to Mr. Graham, and who, not having heard the remark of Mr. Clinton, received the caress with a sweet smile and an upturned face. "Here," said he, "Mr. Clinton is the person who saved the life of your daughter. It is true that I swam with her to the shore, but it was under the mistaken impression that I was bearing to a place of safety my own darling child, whom I little suspected then of having voluntarily relinquished to another her only apparent chance of rescue." "Just like you, Gertrude, just like you!" shouted Kitty and Fanny in a breath, each struggling to obtain a foremost place in the little circle that had gathered round her. "My own noble Gertrude," whispered Emily, as leaning on Mr. Amory's arm, she pressed Gertrude's hand to her lips. "Oh, Gertrude!" exclaimed Isabel, with tears in her eyes. "I didn't know, I never thought " "Your child?" cried Mrs. Graham's loud voice, interrupting Isabel's unfinished exclamation. "Yes, my child, thank God," said Mr. Amory, reverently, "restored at last to her unworthy father, and you have no secrets here, my darling." Gertrude shook her head and glanced at Willie, who now stood at her side, and gladly bestowed by him upon her faithful and far more deserving lover, and he placed her hand in Willie's. There was a moment's pause. All were impressed with the solemnity of the action. Then Mr. Graham came forward, shook each of the young couple heartily by the hand, and passing his sleeve hastily across his eyes, sought his customary refuge in the library. "Gertrude," said Fanny, pulling Gertrude's dress to attract her attention, and speaking in a loud whisper, "are you engaged? Are you engaged to him?" "Yes," whispered Gertrude, anxious, if possible, to gratify Fanny's curiosity and silence her questioning. "Oh, I'm so glad, I'm so glad!" shouted Fanny, dancing round the room and flinging up her arms. "And I'm glad too," said Gracie, catching the tone of congratulation and putting her mouth up to Gertrude for a kiss. "And I am glad," said Mr. Clinton, placing his hands upon those of Willie and Gertrude, which were still clasped together, "that the noble and self-sacrificing girl, whom I have no words to thank, and no power to repay, has heaped a worthy reward in the love of one of the few men with whom a fond father may venture wholly to trust the happiness of his child." Exhausted by so much excitement, Mr. Clinton now complained of sudden faintness, and was assisted to his room by Willie, who, after waiting to see him fully restored, returned to receive the blessing of Emily upon his new hopes, and hear with wonder and delight at the circumstances which attended the discovery of Gertrude's parentage. For although it was an appointment to meet Mr. Amory which had summoned him back to Boston, and he had in the course of their interview acquainted him with the happy termination of a lover's doubts, he had not, until the disclosure took place in Mr. Graham's parlour, received in return the slightest hint of the great surprise which awaited him. He had felt a little astonishment at his friend's expressed desire to join him at once in a visit to Mr. Graham's, but on being informed that he had made the acquaintance of Mrs. Graham in Germany, he concluded that a desire to renew his intercourse with the family, and possibly a slight curiosity to see the lady of his own choice, were the only motives which had influenced him. And now, amid retrospections of the past, thanksgiving for the present, and hopes and aspirations for the future, the evening passed rapidly away. "Come here, Gertie," said Willie. "Come to the window and see what a beautiful night it is." It was indeed a glorious night. Snow lay on the ground. The air was intensely cold without, as might be judged from the quick movements of the pedestrians, and the brilliant icicles with which everything that had an edge was fringed. The stars were glittering too, as they never glitter, except on the most intense of winter nights. The moon was just peeping above an old brown building, the same old corner building which had been visible from the doorstep where Willie and Gertie were wont to sit in their childhood, and from behind which they had often watched the coming of that same round moon. Leaning on Willie's shoulder, Gertrude stood gazing until the full circle was visible in a space of clear and cloudless ether. Neither of them spoke, but their hearts throbbed with the same emotion as they thought of the days that were past. Just then the gas man came quickly up the street, lit, as by an electric touch, the bright burners that in close ranks lined either sidewalk, and in a moment more was out of sight. Gertrude sighed. "It was no such easy task for poor old Uncle True," said she. "There have been great improvements since his time." "There have indeed," said Willie, glancing round the well-lit, warm and pleasantly furnished parlour of his own and Gertrude's home, and resting his eyes at last upon the beloved one by his side, whose beaming face but reflected back his own happiness. "Such improvements, Gertie, as we only dreamt of once. I wish the dear old man could be here to see and share them." A tear started to Gertrude's eye, but pressing Willie's arm, she pointed reverently upward to a beautiful bright star, just breaking forth from a silvery film, which had hitherto half overshadowed it. The star through which Gertrude had ever fancied she could discern the smile of the kind old man. "Dear Uncle True," said she, "his lamp still burns brightly in heaven, Willie, and its light is not yet gone out on earth." In a beautiful town about 30 miles from Boston, and on the shore of one of those hill-embosomed ponds which would be immortalized by the poet in a country less rich than ours with such sheets of blue, transparent water, there stood a mansion house of solid though ancient architecture. It had been the property of Philip Amory's paternal grandparents, and the early home and sole inheritance of his father, who so cherished the spot that it was only with great reluctance, when he was driven to the act by the spur of poverty, that he was induced to part with the much-valued estate. To reclaim the venerable homestead, repair and judiciously modernize the house, and fertilize and adorn the grounds, was now a favorite scheme with Philip. His ample means now rendering it practicable, he lost no time in putting it into execution, and the spring after he returned from his wanderings saw the work in a fair way to be speedily completed. In the meantime, Gertrude's marriage had taken place. The Grahams had removed to their house in town, which, out of compliment to Isabel, who was passing the winter with her aunt, was more than ever crowded with gay company, and the bustling mistress was already projecting changes in her husband's country seat. And Emily, who had parted with her greatest treasure, and found herself in an atmosphere which was little in harmony with her spirit, murmured not, but contented with her lot, neither dreamed of nor asked for outward change, until Philip came to her one day, and taking her hand, said, gently, "This is no home for you, Emily. You are as much alone as I in my solitary farmhouse. We loved each other in childhood, our hearts became one in youth, and have continued so until now. Why should we be longer parted? Your father will not oppose our wishes. And will you, dearest, refuse to bless and gladden the lonely life of your gray-haired lover?" But Emily shook her head, while she answered, with her smile of ineffable sweetness, "Oh, no, Philip, do not speak of it. Think of my frail health and my helplessness." "Your health, dear Emily, is improving. The roses are already coming back to your cheeks. And as for your helplessness, what task can be so sweet to me as teaching you, through my devotion, to forget it? Oh, do not send me away disappointed, Emily. A cruel fate divided us for years. Do not by your own act prolong that separation. Believe me, a union with my early love is my brightest, my only hope of happiness." And she did not withdraw the hand which he held, but yielded the other also to his fervent clasp. "My only thought had been, dear Philip," said she, "that ere this I should have been called to my father's home. And even now I feel many a warning that I cannot be very long for earth. But while I stay, be it longer or shorter, it shall be as you wish. No word of mine shall part hearts so truly one, and your home shall be mine." And when the grass turned green, and the flowers sent up their fragrance, and the birds sang in the branches, and the spring gales blew soft and made a gentle ripple on the water, Emily came to live on the hillside with Philip. And Mrs. Ellis came too, to superintend all things, and especially the dairy, which became henceforth her pride. She had long since tearfully implored, and easily obtained, the forgiveness of the much wronged Philip, and proved by the humility of her voluntary confession that she was not without a woman's heart. Mrs. Prime pleaded hard for the cook situation at the farm, but Emily kindly expostulated with her, saying, "We cannot all leave my father, Mrs. Prime. Who would see to his hot toast and the fire in the library?" And the good old woman saw the matter in the right light and submitted. And is the long wandering, much suffering, and deeply sorrowing exile happy now? He is, but his peace springs not from his beautiful home, his wide possessions, an honorable repute among his fellow men, or even the love of gentle Emily. All these are blessings that he well knows how to prize, but his world-tried soul has found a deeper anchor yet, a surer refuge from the tempest and the storm. For through the power of a living faith he has laid hold on eternal life. The blind girl's prayers are answered. Her last, best work is done. She has cast a ray from her blessed spirit into his darkened soul, and should her call to depart come soon, she will leave behind one to follow in her footsteps, fulfill her charities, and do good on earth, until such time as he be summoned to join her again in heaven. As they go forth in the summer evening, to breathe the balmy air, listen to the winged songster of the grove, and drink in the refreshing influences of a summer sunset, all things speak a holy peace to the newborn heart of him who has so long been a man of sorrow. As the sun sinks among gorgeous clouds, as the western lights grow dim, and the moon and the stars come forth in their solemn beauty, they utter a lesson to his awakened soul, and the voice of nature around, and the still, small voice within, whisper, in gentlest, holiest accents, "The sun shall be no more thy light by day, neither for brightness shall the moon give light unto thee, but the Lord shall be unto thee an everlasting light, and thy God thy glory. Thy sun shall go down no more, neither shall thy moon withdraw itself, for the Lord shall be thine everlasting light, and the days of thy mourning shall be ended." The end. End of chapter 50. End of The Lamplighter by Maria Susanna Cummins.